This week, while the Senate is in recess, C-SPAN 2 has been bringing you hearings from the first part of this year's congressional session. Today, a hearing on the collapse of the World Trade Center. Civil engineers and others testified about the structure's failure to withstand the airplane attacks on September 11th. During this 3-hour hearing, they also talked about federal regulations that might help prevent such failures.
Hearing will come to order. Before proceeding, I ask unanimous consent that Mr. Crowley and Mr. Engel be permitted to sit with the committee. Without objection, so ordered. I want to welcome everyone to this hearing on a most important but difficult subject, the investigation into the collapse of the World Trade Center. It is indeed a difficult subject because it is at once emotionally rending and intellectually complex. And it's also difficult because it forces us to cast a critical eye on the dedicated work of public servants and public-spirited volunteers who are taking action amid chaos brought on by an unforeseen and unprecedented tragedy. But despite these difficulties and the discomfort they may engender, we felt we needed to put together this hearing. First, we believe that we owe it to the victims and their families to learn everything possible about what happened in those horrifying first hours of September 11th, not just to satisfy their immediate needs and yearnings, but to ensure that such a catastrophic building failure and the resulting loss of life never happen again. I must say that the current investigation, some would argue that review is the more appropriate word, seems to be shrouded in excessive secrecy. This has unnecessarily increased the family's anxiety while actually complicating matters. I hope this hearing, by airing the facts of the investigation, will dispel unnecessary concerns while allowing legitimate ones to be pursued more productively. But perhaps even more important for the committee, we need to have this hearing because the Trade Center collapse raises questions about federal responsibilities and federal policies, responsibilities and policies that have broader application than this one terrifying and, we pray, unique incident. The federal government, as a matter of course, takes on investigations of catastrophic building failures, whatever their cause. That's the only way we as a nation can learn from building failures and change our building and fire codes to prevent future ones. Indeed, the engineering of buildings to withstand earthquake damage has improved markedly as a result of federally supported efforts. Yet in this case, the investigation has faced numerous obstacles. Federal agencies did not coordinate sufficiently. Some were slow to react. No organized team was at the site for weeks. Potentially valuable evidence has been irretrievably lost, and blueprints were unavailable for months. What this experience clearly points up is that the federal government needs to put in place standard investigative protocols and procedures right now, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel each time we face a building failure. That's one change in federal policy that ought to result from the World Trade Center experience. Another significant lesson of the Trade Center collapse is that we need to understand a lot more about the behavior of skyscrapers and about fire if we are going to prevent future tragedies. All of our witnesses today will call for an expanded federal research effort into the details of what happened at the World Trade Center and what that means for buildings generally. I wholeheartedly endorse that call. My colleagues and I will have many questions today about the nature and scope and financing of that follow-up effort, but I, for one, think we need to move forward with it. We'll also do some following up of our own. I expect that the committee will have a hearing on the report of the current Trade Center. We'll have a hearing on the report of the current Trade Center report when it is released in April. And we'll obviously continue to oversee the related activities of the agencies in our jurisdiction, and we'll pursue any federal issues that merit further review. So all of us here, I believe, understand that we are undertaking a heavy responsibility today by reviewing the response to the World Trade Center collapse. September 11th is still a fresh wound. But this hearing is not so much about the past as it is about ensuring that we protect lives in the future. We are not here to point fingers, but to ensure that any problems that occurred in the wake of the Trade Center collapse do not hamper future investigations. We are here because the only way to move forward is to try to understand what happened on a day that was so incomprehensible. With that, yield to Mr. Wiener.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first, let me begin by expressing my thanks to you. While some of our committees have been slow to take up the challenge of the post-September 11th analysis and legislative action, you have been a true leader in getting the Science Committee involved. On November 12th, I and my constituents had the misfortune, and hundreds of families were ravaged by the crash of Flight 586. Within literally moments of that plane crash, the National Transportation Safety Board was on the ground, sequestering evidence, interviewing witnesses, subpoenaing information if necessary, and since then they have offered periodic reports. 1 month and a day earlier, when the World Trade Center collapsed, nothing could have been further from the truth. According to reports that we've heard since, there has been no comprehensive investigation. One expert in fire engineering concluded that there was virtually a non-existent investigation. We haven't examined any aspects of the collapse that might have impacted rescue worker procedures, even in this last month. Second, reports have emerged that crucial evidence has been mishandled. Over 80% of the steel from the World Trade Center site has already been sold for recycling. Much of it, if not all of it, before investigators and scientists can analyze the information. Third, we've allowed this investigation to become woefully bogged down in infighting and lack of cooperation among agencies. Researchers from FEMA did not get timely access to the designs of the building. News accounts have said there has been friction between engineers and FEMA because of concerns about where the information would wind up. Even the National Science Foundation, which was awarded grants to several scientists to study the collapse, but didn't coordinate these efforts with FEMA or the American Society of Civil Engineers. And finally, we have seen painfully that the financial commitment to this investigation simply is not there. It is not uncommon to spend tens of millions of dollars investigating why a plane crashed, but we've yet to spend even $1 million on this investigation, and the Bush administration has refused to commit to release the full funding necessary. But what difference does it make? Some might ask. Who could have foreseen such a catastrophic event? Well, the same could be said, frankly, any time a plane crashes. Yet every time we learn about why one plane crashed, we save future people from being victims as well. We could learn what firefighters should know before they go into buildings. We should learn what families like Vincent and Demencia Ragusa, who are from my district, who lost their son, a firefighter who went into that building, unaware, as I'm sure many of us as we were, that those buildings were about to go down. We can learn about future design of buildings, and perhaps as importantly, we might be able to revisit buildings that are currently standing and learn ways to make their occupants and firefighters safer. That is why I'm going to be introducing legislation to give the National Institutes of Standards and Technology similar line authorities that the National Transportation Safety Board has. Whether it's a plane crash or a building collapse, we must get to the truth. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wiener. Mr. Hall.
Mr. Chairman, I'll be brief because there are others who ought to speak, but I certainly join you and others here in our appreciation of those that are here, and Mr. Shea, who's here representing Joe Albaugh, who I think does a wonderful job for this country and a wonderful job for the president. And there's much,
as does Mr. Shea, a very long and distinguished career.
Yes, and there's much more to be done. I think it's more important for Anthony Weiner to be the spokesman here and for Steve Israel, because they are sensible, sincere, caring, and Sherry, you're the head of this committee. You're going to see that New York gets that not as much as they're entitled to, but everything that we can do within our reach. And Mr. Grucci is doing a good job for his state. I'm just honored to be associated with these men, and with the words Mr. Weiner has just spoken. It's a horrible time. It's a terrible time. We're battling an enemy with no Navy, no Marine Corps, no Army, no boundary lines. We don't know where they are, and I think it's a sorry, sad war, and it's a war nobody is going to come out to win. We just have to hang together, though, and as a Democrat, I urge everybody to support the president. He's a commander-in-chief. We are at war. We're a nation at war, and we ought to be closer together than we are today. I don't agree with everything anybody does, says, or thinks. I have my own mind. The day they struck those two buildings up there, I became a New Yorker. I am a New Yorker, and I appreciate every one of you, and God bless all of you. I want to yield whatever time I have left to Steve Israel, who has some words that need to be said. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes Mr. Israel for 3 minutes and 20 seconds.
I thank the chairman, and I thank Ranking Member Hall for the time, and let me join with all of my colleagues in extending condolences to all of the families who suffered devastating losses, who have assembled with us today. I represent in my district over 100 families who lost someone in the rubble of the World Trade Center. In the days after September 11th, they wanted to know why our national intelligence and why our airport security wasn't strong enough to withstand an attack. And now they're asking whether our steel was strong enough to withstand an attack, whether our building codes, our fire codes, our safety codes were strong enough to withstand the attack. They want to know what we've learned from the collapse of the World Trade Center, what we learned from the collapse of the federal building in Oklahoma City. They want to know whether older buildings, buildings far older than the World Trade Center and the Murrah building in Oklahoma City, have the steel and the safety codes that are necessary to withstand the same kind of catastrophic attack that occurred at the World Trade Center. Since September 11th, we've responded to the assault on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon in many ways. Militarily, we have eviscerated al-Qaeda and the Taliban. We've started to revamp our airport security systems. We've passed a comprehensive bioterrorism act. And even on Capitol Hill, as we came to this committee hearing from voting on the floor, we saw all sorts of new steel barricades and shatterproof glass that have been erected to protect members of Congress. But we are still asking our police and our fire, our rescue, and our emergency services personnel around the country to risk their lives rushing into buildings without really knowing what they need to know about the construction, the integrity, and the technical conditions that exist in those buildings. We need to know what can be done to make our buildings more structurally sound, what can be done to control intense fires caused by airplanes or bombs, what new precautions should be taken to minimize the weakening of steel, even under the most catastrophic conditions. Mr. Chairman, I went with many of my colleagues to the wreckage of the World Trade Center only days after the attack with our president. We have an obligation to those who were lost in that rubble, and we have an obligation to everyone who walks into a skyscraper around our country to get some answers, and to get some answers today. And even more vital, to act on what we learned. Protecting our buildings is just as important a homeland security and economic security issue as flying F-16s over Washington and New York. I want to thank the chairman for convening this hearing. I intend to work with the chairman on a bipartisan basis to make sure that we are allocating the resources and the dollars necessary to study what happened on September 11th and to ensure that it never happens again. And I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes Mr. Grucci.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me just start off by saying I associate myself with the remarks being made here today about the need to find out what went wrong, how it went wrong, and how to prevent it from going wrong in the future. You know, the tragedy of September 11th was one that one could never have predicted and never could have fathomed. The extent to which our nation was affected may never be completely understood. However, we continue to work together and to try and find the answers we can muster. My congressional district is located just 40 miles from Ground Zero. My constituents were some of the first responders, opening up their emergency rooms and volunteering their rescue services to their brothers, sisters, cousins, friends, and all that were trapped in the rubble. Close to 60 of my constituents were lost that fateful day. America sat with fear and awe, our eyes captivated by the horrific sight of the World Trade Center towers 1 and 2 crumbling to the city streets. These amazing skyscrapers were brought down by the powerful blast of jet airplanes carrying close to 10,000 gallons of jet fuel. The force of these blasts were enough to bring down 100 stories of steel and concrete. As the many brave and caring volunteers continue to clean up the horror and debris in Lower Manhattan, federal investigators continue to attempt to piece together as much information as possible. I am heartened that the Science Committee is taking a closer look at the engineering and structural investigations surrounding the collapse of the World Trade Center. I look forward to the informative testimony from our expert witnesses to better understand the issues surrounding this tragedy. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the ranking member for pulling this meeting together. I think today we'll hopefully start to hear some of the answers that will bring closure to some people's minds as to what happened, but in order and give us the ability to prevent these types of things from happening in the future. And I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Grucci. And all members of the committee will have 5 days in which to revise and extend their remarks. As is the practice of the committee, we initially reserve 5 minutes for each side, Republicans and Democrats, for opening statement. And we ask our colleagues on the committee to defer any opening statements so that we can get right to the witnesses and the task at hand, to learn from their testimony, to probe, and to finally develop something that is responsive and responsible. And so all members will have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks. I would also point out that because of the extensive interest in this hearing, room 2325 is an overflow room, and that too has a full house. And further, I'd like to acknowledge the President in the audience of a special group of people. The Skyscraper Safety Campaign, which is a project of parents and families of firefighters and World Trade Center victims. They are here as very interested observers. We want you to know that our hearts and our prayers are with you, but you have every right to expect something more than our good intentions and our prayers. We are determined to go forward from this hearing to develop policy that will be responsive to a clearly identified need for our nation and its future. Yeah, and I ask unanimous consent that everybody be allowed to introduce their statements to the record at this juncture, and we'll, without objection so ordered, we'll proceed right to our panel of very distinguished witnesses. Mr. Robert Shea, Acting Administrator, Federal Insurance and Mitigation Administration, and Mr. Craig Wingo, Director, Division of Engineering, Science, and Technology from the Federal Energy Management Administration. Dr. W. Gene Corley, American Society of Civil Engineers, Chair of the Building Performance Assessment Team, which we will constantly refer to as CPAT, reviewing the WTC disaster. Professor Glenn Corbett, Assistant Professor of Fire Science, John Jay College, New York City. Dr. Astaneh, Professor, Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, University of California. And Dr. Arden Bement, Director, National Institute of Standards and Technology. As the committee clearly can appreciate, we have a panel of very distinguished witnesses, and we look forward to hearing your testimony. We would appreciate, as is customary, that you try to summarize your statement in 5 minutes or so. We've all had the advantage of your full statement, which will be in the record at this juncture, and I would imagine that my colleagues have joined me in reading this testimony in preparation for this important hearing. Chair's not going to be arbitrary. This is too important to let a minute or two interfere with making an important point. But we would appreciate your summarizing your testimony. We have 6 distinguished witnesses, and we have a number of very interested members of Congress who want to have a dialogue with you. and let me thank you for serving as resources for this committee. Mr. Shea, you're up first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the members of the committee. As you indicated, I am the acting administrator of the Federal Insurance and Mitigation Administration. I'm here today because Joe Albaugh asked me to be here to address this committee. With me is Craig Wingo, who is my senior executive in charge of my Engineering Sciences and Technology Division. Thanks. Mr. Wingo is also the executive that I hold responsible for the Building Performance Assessment Team activity. I will be making the statement, and Mr. Wingo will not at this point. I respectfully request that my written testimony be entered into the record and that I be allowed a few minutes to make a few verbal comments. If that meets with the approval of the chair and the committee, I'll proceed. FEMA operates under the authority of the Stafford Act to respond to disasters. This is an immensely powerful mechanism. Am I still missing here? Okay.
The microphone closer, if you will, so
I'll do that.
We have a crowded room. We want to make certain.
Is better, Chairman?
That's much better.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. This is an immensely powerful mechanism to respond to disasters. Embedded in the Act is our charter to provide supplemental support to the efforts and available resources of state and local government, but clearly recognizing their primacy. Further, as FEMA operates under the aegis of the Federal Response Plan, the way the federal government responds to catastrophic events. Honed over 30 years, this plan allows FEMA to coordinate the relief and recovery efforts of the combined assets of the entire federal government and state and local government, but particularly by relying on existing expertise and capability. In large part, we are doers, but we conduct our business by coordinating. For example, under the plan, one of the emergency support functions is led by the Corps of Engineers, not by FEMA. Further, in this incident, Emergency Support Function 9 became the primary example of our level of effort to provide support. It is called Urban Search and Rescue. Essentially, this is highly trained and equipped local fire forces from across the country. So relying on resources and expertise provides for a very effective response system, which is also highly efficient. In the immediate aftermath of this event, FEMA's singular focus was the search and rescue, recovery of victims, and frankly, reestablishing the viability of the New York Fire Department. Last week, I spent some time with Chief Nick Russo, a 29-year veteran of the Hall, Massachusetts Fire Department. Chief Russo watched the events that day and understood the impact on the New York firefighters. So he gathered 6 other chiefs from his area and was at ground zero within hours. His role was to aid in the restructuring of the incident command and also perform search and rescue. Chief Russo told me that his mission matched exactly that of FEMA. Further, when it became painfully clear that the operation shifted to recovery of the victims, that became the single focus of the federal, state, and local efforts. The effort to recover victims lasted throughout September and into early October, and it still continues. Nonetheless, on September 12th, the day afterwards, FEMA and the American Society of Civil Engineers began collaborating on the implementation of a building performance assessment team. The National Institute of Standards and Technology was a partner in this pursuit. The role of the BPAT is twofold. First, to aid in the recovery process through a rapid assessment in order to incorporate mitigation measures into the rebuilding process, but frankly limited in scope to Stafford Act authorities, that is, to the rebuilding process of the affected facilities. Secondly, though, as we go through that process, to use the products of this effort to influence building practices through changes to building codes. The BPAT, or Building Performance Assessment Team process, does not lend itself to complex, long-term studies, and it was never intended to do so. Because of the limited resources and expertise, FEMA uses the same philosophy as the Federal Response Plan. We look to other authorities and expertise of other federal agencies for those missions. In this case, the appropriate agency is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They should conduct the long-term, complex studies that must naturally flow from this initial BPAT effort. In my opinion, appropriate studies of the complex issues presented in this fire and structural collapse will take years to complete. Let me also say that I have not seen a draft BPAT report, but it is important, in my opinion, as well, to preserve the scientific and technical integrity of this study. Jumping to conclusions will ultimately serve no one well in the end. At this point, it is my understanding that the conclusions associated with this report have not yet been finalized. Therefore, while I cannot share insights about the causal factors of the collapse of the World Trade Center from either a fire or structural point of view, I would like to share these observations, which are based on my experience of 25 years. In this country, we build buildings to a minimum standard. They're probably the best in the world, but they are, in fact, to a minimum standard. What we learned from this tragedy is probably beyond the current generation of buildings. But what we can influence is the next generation of buildings. So I believe it would be prudent to carefully pursue our eventual conclusions. Second, the World Trade Center was a tragedy. Frankly, it was an anomaly. No one who viewed it that day, including myself, believed that those towers would fall. Our collective thought process for laymen and engineers and firefighters changed that day forever. While the results are still being analyzed and years of study may lie ahead, I can still make the following general observations associated with these types of buildings. Firefighters in many communities are involved in the building code enforcement process, but this is frankly not universally the case. So we need to think more broadly, as all of us have had to be challenged after the events of September 11th. Not only should fire and structural engineers be involved, but we also need firefighters inspecting buildings during the construction process. And the reason is very straightforward. When experienced firefighters look at the construction process, they can tell you what the failure mechanisms will be if they ever have to go into that building and fight a fire. Secondly, we need to thoroughly explore and embrace the idea of redundant fire systems or in-place protection systems for high occupancy vehicles. Thirdly, there was a failure of firefighter communication systems during the event, and it continued well into the search and rescue efforts. It was literally observed that as the search and rescue efforts were going on, there were handwritten notes being passed in order to affect communications. Clearly, the issues that I've just outlined need to be addressed in the longer-term research effort. I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the time.
Thank you, Mr. Wingo. I assume Mr. Shea speaks for you also. Dr. Corley.
Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Gene Corley. I appear before the committee today on behalf of the American Society of Civil Engineers. In my volunteer capacity at ASCE, I serve as chair of the Building Performance Assessment Team, which is studying the collapse of the World Trade Center. I'm employed by CTL, an engineering firm in Chicago, Illinois, as Senior Vice President. The tragic events of September 11th have served as a grim reminder that there is no limit to the destructive forces that man can use to damage or destroy the nation's infrastructure. We all personally mourn those lost in the attack. On the afternoon of September 11th, the Structural Engineering Institute of the American Society of Civil Engineers began assembling two teams of experts to study the performance of the buildings at the World Trade Center complex and at the Pentagon. The goal of the studies is to increase our knowledge of understanding of how buildings subjected to extreme forces, such as those caused by the crash and resulting fires, perform under these unprecedented circumstances. Studies of this type were performed by ASCE 6 times in the year 2000 following other disasters. ASCE provides the internal mechanism to organize and fund these studies. In 1995, ASCE, in partnership with FEMA, organized a team that I headed to examine the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City and the surrounding area after that bombing. The teams assembled by SEI, ASCE, and a coalition of professional organizations that joined us are comprised of academics and other leading experts in the fields of structural analysis and design, fire engineering, blast effects, and building materials. On October 1st, the WTC study became a joint effort between ASCE and the Federal Emergency Management Agency, a partnership which continues to this day. The partnership with FEMA has been very beneficial to the overall progress of the WTC team. In addition to providing funds, FEMA has provided logistical assistance, organizational and operational guidance, assistance in obtaining and organizing the needed data, and will provide the resources to publish the report. Team members have examined structural debris from the Freshkills landfill on Staten Island and at 2 recycling yards in New Jersey. Samples of the structural steel were obtained and have been subjected to laboratory analysis. They're presently being stored at the National Institute of Standards and Technology in Gaithersburg, Maryland, for use in future studies. In the 10 years in which ASCE has been conducting studies of disasters, we've learned that our teams will always encounter impediments. However, we have also learned that with time and persistence, these difficulties are either overcome or an alternate approach is found to enable a team to satisfactorily complete their studies. Delay in the receipt of plans did somewhat hinder the team's ability to confirm our understanding of the buildings. Through the efforts of FEMA and others, the team received the engineering plans for the towers on January 8th of this year, and work is proceeding. There has been concern expressed by others that the work of the team has been hampered because debris was removed from the site and has subsequently been processed for recycling. The team has had full access to scrap yards and to the site and has been able to obtain numerous samples. At this point, there is no indication that having access to each piece of steel from the World Trade Center would have made a significant difference to understanding the performance of the structures. Resources are always an issue with building performance studies, particularly one whose magnitude and scale is unprecedented. The total amount of resources being dedicated to support the team's activities is approximately $1 million, plus an estimated additional $1 million in volunteer time by our team members. This support has allowed the team to do the initial reconnaissance of the site and the building materials, begin the process of hypothesis setting, and conduct some limited testing. It is our opinion that $40 million or more is needed to fully fund the necessary additional comprehensive study. As many in the United States and the world examine the future of tall buildings, it is important to look at how well these buildings performed under extreme circumstances. It must be remembered that large commercial aircraft hit the World Trade Center towers, yet both withstood the initial impact. Efforts such as those being conducted by the building performance study teams and studies emanating from this initial study will seek to extend the performance of structures to allow occupants and rescuers time to reach safety. There are 2 high priority needs from the structural engineering community which I would like to draw your attention. The first is the issue of progressive collapse. The second is the issue of fire structure interaction. We believe that each of these needs are crucial to advancing the health, safety, and welfare of the citizens of our nation. The work will require a substantial partnership between public agencies such as NIST and private organizations such as ASCE and our coalition partners. Thank you for the opportunity to express ASCE's views. We offer Congress and all the agencies involved in the recovery efforts ASCE's full resources to manage the nation's critical infrastructure needs. We're ready to help in any way possible.
Thank you very much, Dr. Corley. Dr. Corbett.
Yes, good afternoon, Chairman Boehlert and members of the House Committee on Science. I want to thank you for inviting me to speak on the topic of the World Trade Center disaster investigation. This is an issue of significant national importance, and I speak for many who understand this importance. I'd like to discuss three issues with you today: an analysis of the current building performance assessment study of the World Trade Center collapse, a proposal for an enhanced national disaster investigation response protocol for future disasters, and a recommendation for a commission on the World Trade Center disaster. In the wake of the loss of the World Trade Center, many questions began to arise as to the cause of the collapse of the Twin Towers. What were the specific causal factors of the collapse, and what was the exact sequence of events that led to the collapse? These are important questions that impact national security. We're a nation at risk. There are many high-rise buildings and structures across the country, and many more on the way, and we need to learn from the events of 9/11 and apply these lessons. As engineers, architects, builders, as firefighters, and as citizens who occupy high-rises, and as those who are in a position to protect those citizens, there are critical questions regarding this collapse, and they need answering. We need to extract all of the lessons for future generations who will live and work in high-rise buildings. The building performance assessment currently being conducted of the collapse is just that, an assessment, not an investigation, in my opinion. While the Building Performance Assessment Team is composed of an elite group of engineers and scientists, the standard procedures used by the BPAT team have proven to be inadequate. Hailing the collapse study as an assessment rather than as an investigation has allowed valuable evidence in the form of the tower's structural steel to be destroyed. It is a steel that holds the primary key to understanding the chronology of the events resulting in the collapse. Without an official investigative presence, the FEMA-sanctioned assessment team did not have the authority to ensure that all the structural steel was thoroughly examined and the crucial steel from the points of impact were saved for examination. It is my understanding that only a handful of pieces of the steel from the points of impact have been secured to date. In addition, the BPAT team studying the collapse has apparently been hampered in accessing building construction documents. These problems will have an impact on the BPAT report that is due to be released in April. The lack of significant amounts of steel for examination will make it difficult, if not impossible, to make a definitive statement as to the cause and chronology of the collapse. The collapse of the World Trade Center the World Trade Center towers were the largest structural collapses in world history. A disaster of such epic proportions demanded that we would fully resource a comprehensive, detailed investigation. Instead, we are staffing the BPAT with part-time engineers and scientists on a shoestring budget. The current World Trade Center disaster inquiry has exposed a gaping hole in the way that we investigate disasters. We don't have a comprehensive plan for disaster investigations except for plane crashes, and we don't apply the necessary resources for a complete and thorough investigation. We need to have an enhanced disaster investigation response protocol that provides for a systematic, multidisciplinary, and scientifically rigorous approach. We need to bring in the experts in an organized and rapid manner to extract all the lessons from the disaster. Finally, we need to make sure that the lessons are actually applied. I would recommend that a task force be impaneled to develop an enhanced disaster investigation protocol. Given FEMA's role in disaster response and their critical disaster mitigation responsibilities, I would recommend that this task force be initiated within their organization. With regard to the World Trade Center disaster, there are several other additional areas that need to be investigated and studied. Specifically, there are 5 additional focus areas that are of concern: an analysis of the building design itself, the firefighting operations, the building evacuations, the search and rescue operations, and the relationship between the disaster and our building and fire codes. In order to gather all the lessons, we must analyze the disaster as a whole. Studying them as individual items eliminates the critical process of information sharing and understanding the interrelationships between these different focus areas. We need to bring all 6 of these focus areas together as a collective group under one roof, so to speak. Studying the disaster as a whole will also ensure coordination, avoid duplication, and verify that all areas of concern are being covered. I would recommend that a commission on the World Trade Center disaster be immediately organized to initiate a comprehensive investigation and to coordinate the existing public and private research projects that are already underway. For an example, an ad hoc committee entitled the World Trade Center Evacuation Study Initiative has been meeting for several months to study the issues of the building evacuations. Study groups like these need to be brought together. A variety of important lessons will come from the World Trade Center disaster that will apply to our current national building codes. For example, our current requirements in high-rise structures treat a 15-story building the same as we treat a 100-story building. In fact, from a firefighting perspective, a 15-story building is completely different than a 100-story building, as we well know. Another example is that the test that we utilize to establish the fire resistance of beams and columns, steel columns. The test was first developed in the 1920s, and yet we're still using the same test with the same 1920s fires in the year 2002. We need to address and correct these kinds of deficiencies. We can learn many lessons from the disaster at the World Trade Center. In fact, we must learn these lessons. The lessons will form better building codes, improve building design methodologies, improved emergency procedures, and enhanced protection against terrorist attacks. We must assure that these lessons are actually applied, increasing the level of safety and security for all of our citizens. I thank you, Chairman Boehlert, and the honorable members of the Committee on Science for giving me this important opportunity to share my thoughts with you. I would be happy to answer any questions that you may have. And
thank you very much, Dr. Corbett. Dr. Astaneh.
With your permission, Mr. Chairman, with your permission, I'd like to use the projection.
Lights dimmed, please, so we get a better. All right, thank you.
Chairman Boehlert, members of the committee, families of victims of the 9/11 terrorist attack. It's a great honor for me to testify here today. My involvement in the collapse of the World Trade Center is to conduct reconnaissance of the collapsed and damaged World Trade Center buildings and to collect structural engineering perishable data. The main objectives are to document failure modes, learn as much as possible from the collapse, collect material samples for future testing, and conduct a realistic failure analysis of the towers subjected to impact and ensuing fire in order to understand the causes of the collapse. Our project was funded by the National Science Foundation as one of the 8 Quick Response Research Awards a few days after the World Trade Center collapse. The other 7 NSF grants are in the areas of fire engineering, social sciences, and response and recovery. I started my studies almost a week after the collapse, and since then I have been able to investigate the structural elements of the World Trade Center and have collected data on failure modes, fire and impact damage, and have identified and saved sections of the structure that appear to be impacted by the plane or have collapsed under an intense fire. I have also investigated quality of construction. Here are some samples of my work. I was not able to access ground zero, so I have done my investigation at the scrapyard, looking into important failure modes and collecting important items from the recycling plant. We were and still are planning to build a realistic computer-based structural model of the World Trade Center towers, subject the model to realistically simulated impact of the planes and ensuing fire, and conduct a detailed stress analysis. However, since we have not been able to obtain drawings, even now, and other data, we are unable to proceed with our studies. I would like to show you the results of such analysis of a generic building and what type of stress analysis we can do on World Trade Center to understand its collapse. Here is an example of a steel structure subjected to impact of a fully loaded, fueled 747 airplane. This is not artistic rendering or animation of the impact. This is the result of mathematical analysis of stress. Here is the plane approaching the building with 450 miles per hour. It impacts the building and damages the columns and enters. Close up, here you can see the damage to structure while we have eliminated the plane and made it invisible. Here's the damaged area. Here is to the right bottom is the plane, and you are seeing the stresses developed in the plane and how plane breaks. We have made the structure invisible. Notice the wings, in this case, clipping and dropping, but the plane breaks because of the stresses being so high. After plane enters the building, we can analyze the heat effects. In this case, the damaged structure is subjected to the heat effects, and you can see the spread of temperature and weakening of steel and final collapse. This is what we like to do for World Trade Center. The impediments to our studies were not having access to ground zero and surrounding damaged buildings, not having enough time to inspect the World Trade Center steel before it was recycled, not having the drawings, videotapes, photographs, and other data on the building to conduct our analysis of the collapse. On the subject of research needs, there are pressing needs for short-term as well as long-term research related to the World Trade Center collapse. In short term, there is an urgent need for a comprehensive, in-depth, and scientific study of the collapse of the World Trade Center towers. Due to unprecedented nature of the collapse and its complexity, a broad-based team of experts from academia, government agencies, and private sector needs to be assembled to conduct such research-oriented investigations within a federal entity such as NSF or NIST. In the long term, there is a need for major and sustained funding to conduct basic and applied research on various aspects of terrorist attacks. Such research programs can be directed by the National Science Foundation, among others, which over the last few decades has directed so successfully the research and technology development in the area of earthquake hazard mitigation, among many others. As for the fire research, NIST traditionally has been the leading research and development agency. Also, a significant amount of research has been done in academia. Such research activities, supported by the Congress, can result in development of scientific methods and technologies that can be used to assure life safety in the event of future terrorist attacks and minimize the impact of such attacks on the national security, economy, and quality of our lives. I would like to take this opportunity and thank Chairman Boehlert and members of the Committee on Science for inviting me to testify. I would be available to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Dr. Astaneh, and especially appreciate your very specific recommendations. Dr. Bement. Doctor, microphone, please.
Got it, I think. Ranking Member Hall and members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to testify on this role in the investigation into the collapse of the World Trade Center towers. The collapse of these towers was the worst building disaster in human history. Engineers, emergency responders, and the nation did not anticipate and were largely unprepared for such a catastrophe. Shortly after the attacks on the World Trade Center, NIST building and fire researchers began assisting federal and local agencies in many ways to investigate the spread of fire through the buildings and their subsequent collapse. Using preliminary information from videos of the attack, our researchers were able to use previously developed computer models to simulate the spread of fire and smoke in the buildings. At FEMA's request, NIST conducted a comparison and analysis of the current building and fire codes of New York City with national codes. This report has now been submitted to FEMA and I believe has also been submitted to the committee. One of our researchers participated in the initial assessment of the WTC collapse conducted by the American Society of Civil Engineers, and we are lending our expertise in structural disasters to ASCE and the Structural Engineers Association of New York by storing steel from the World Trade Center at our Gaithersburg headquarters for further scientific study. Additionally, NIST is working informally with a coalition of organizations from industry, standards bodies, code regulators, professional groups, and federal agencies as well as academics, in an effort to launch a comprehensive public-private response program to address critically and urgently needed improvements to national building and fire standards, codes, and practices. The events of September 11th have brought even more focus and priority to this already important issue. As part of this broader effort, NIST recently conducted a 2-day workshop on fire resistance determination and performance prediction that brought together leading international experts and practitioners and academic faculty to define research needs in this area. And NIST is organizing a workshop later this spring to establish a national plan for prevention of progressive structural collapse. The workshop steering committee consists of leading practitioners and key federal partners from the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the General Services Administration, and FEMA. NIST has been responsive to all requests for technical assistance. In February, FEMA communicated to NIST its support of a NIST-led technical investigation of the building and fire safety issues related to the WTC disaster under our existing legislative authorities. As required by our legislative authorities, we have consulted with local officials on a possible investigation, and we've received uniform support. Mr. Chairman, at this time, I would like to submit for the record letters expressing support for and cooperation in such an investigation from FEMA and the local authorities.
Without objection, so ordered.
NIST is currently working very closely with FEMA and the administration on this investigation, since an in-depth technical investigation and broader response program would go well beyond the scope of the building performance assessments conducted by FEMA. One part of our proposed funding plan for the broader program includes the soon-to-be-submitted reprogramming of funds from our NIST-based budget, and it's my understanding that should be on the Hill today. In addition, the President's fiscal year 2003 budget requests a $2 million increase to go toward this effort. The NIST proposed investigation would examine the building construction, the integrity of the materials used, and the technical conditions that combined to cause the World Trade Center disaster. Our efforts would involve the participation of technical experts from industry, academia, and other laboratories, as well as liaison with federal, state, and local authorities. The steel currently stored at NIST could provide useful information to evaluate the quality of steel used in the construction of the buildings, to determine the maximum temperature reached by the steel in the region of severe fires where collapse initiated, and to identify the possible mechanisms of failure based on visual observations of failed components. The results from the proposed investigation would be extremely valuable, but they would be meaningless unless we take the knowledge gained and put it to practical use. That is why NIST is working with FEMA and the private sector on the broader effort that I mentioned earlier. Specific improvements to building and fire practices, standards, and codes can only be identified if we are able to determine the exact sequence of events that led to progressive collapse of the buildings and the associated loss of life and injuries. Fire played a critical and visible role in the collapse of the WTC buildings and contributed to the Pentagon's damage. Current building design practice does not consider fire as a design condition. We now have the capability to simulate building fires on the computer to explain critical events and outcomes to an extent previously not possible. In short, we can provide the technical basis and guidance for fire safety design and retrofit of structures, the predictive tools and test methods for fire resistance determination, and the performance criteria for fireproofing materials. In addition, there are many critical gaps in our understanding of human behavior, protection, emergency response, and mobility as they relate to fires and other similar disasters that could also be addressed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd be pleased to respond to questions from the committee.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bement, and thank all of you. And the chair is going to be somewhat arbitrary in the initial round of questioning, restricting, including the chair, to 5 minutes, and then we'll have a second round, and as many rounds are necessary. Mr. Shea, in your statement, you said rightly so that FEMA's singular goal in the immediate aftermath of the attack was to support local jurisdictions in the rescue of trapped firefighters and workers. Nothing had a higher priority.
Right.
And I can certainly understand that. But can you explain why the BPAT team was not able to enter the site until October, even though volunteers were at the site almost immediately and the ASCE team was in place within days? Why October?
Perhaps the best way to do this, Dr. Corley, maybe you can help explain why we were there in October.
Yes, I can add some information to that. The team, as it was officially put together, indeed did not get to the site until October. However, as early as the Saturday after the attack, we had at least 3 people who at that time were on our team on site in connection with the search and rescue, and they were beginning to collect information at that time.
But mostly observing. I mean, the most important thing going on right then was the search and rescue effort, but there was no organized effort to gather evidence, if you will. And I know there's some dispute between you and Dr. Corbett in your statements where you say the investigation or the review has not been compromised because of so-called lost evidence, and Dr. Corbett feels it was. But it seems to me an inordinate amount of time before the BPAT team was in there really doing something. A couple of people there is not what I would consider the type of response necessary.
Yes, well, those people were indeed collecting very vital information to us, but the reason that we were unable to get in until that time was the combination of the search and rescue and the criminal investigation were the things that we understand, at least, were preventing us from getting access.
Well, they were more of observers. They didn't have badges. They weren't there in any official capacity that anyone could identify. But, well, that's something we're going to talk more about. And incidentally, these questions today, we're not going to get to all the questions, obviously, and we are determined to be as thorough as possible. So, and this is not coming out of my time as I'm making this observation from the chair. They're going to follow up with very specific questions, and we want specificity in the responses in a very timely manner. We're all very serious about this, and our objective is not to point fingers at anyone. Our objective is to get to the bottom of it and to make certain we do what is necessary to prevent something like this from ever happening again. Dr. Bement, you know, why did NIST play initially, at least it appears to us, sort of a passive and minor role in getting on with the investigation? Is it because there's no clear definition of who has responsibility for what?
Well, I take your question as support for the fact that we should do this investigation, except we should have done it sooner, perhaps.
I agree, and I agree.
The role of NIST is somewhat circumscribed by statute.
And where things are circumscribed, we're going to make it crystal clear.
Thank you.
So there's no doubt in the future.
We have anxiety about that. As a matter of fact, we've been a very strong advocate for this establishment of a National Construction Studies Board that would operate very similar to a National Transportation Studies Board that would overcome some of the deficiencies in being able to carry on the timely investigation that you're talking about. And we at NIST would be very happy to work with the committee in developing that policy.
Staff has just pointed out to me that very specifically in the law, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, on its own initiative, but only after consultation with local authorities, may initiate and conduct investigations to determine the causes of structural failures and et cetera, et cetera.
That's correct.
But we will work with you.
As a matter of fact, acting on that authority, I requested the reprogramming action that is coming up to the Hill now to provide the funding to continue the work that we're currently doing. Also, during the months of November and December, we did have numerous meetings with authorities in New York to do just what this authority requires, a consultation with local authorities, and the letters that I submitted for the record are in response to those meetings and those understandings. We felt it was very important early to get full concurrence and full cooperation because of the vital information that is held by the Port Authority, by the designers of the building, and other sources of vital information. So we've been marshaling that support.
You know, one of the things that really bothers me is we don't have a system in place where there is immediacy to get a team on site, not to interfere in any way, shape, or manner with search and rescue, because that's the most important activity of all, but a team on site to immediately begin to have a video and oral history of what happened and when it happened. And I noticed in some of the testimony, and I've spent hours reading all the testimony, because I want you to know this, I'm not the only one. We are all very serious about this mission. But I noticed the networks have been asked to cooperate, and they have been, but slowly, as we're assembling this whole record of what happened in the film. But wouldn't it seem to make sense that we have somebody, whether it's in this shop or FEMA shop or somebody, a team of people immediately on site at a disaster, particularly one of this magnitude, to start recording?
I fully agree.
And so that we don't have Dr. Corley and Dr. Corbett at odds sometime in the future as we're conducting this review. Dr. Corley says he doesn't feel the investigation was compromised because we have enough steel. A lot of people say a lot of that steel is gone. We don't have the evidence we need to investigate to know what happened and when. But if we had an immediate team of people with a video and oral history being recorded,
a video record would have been, or a photographic record of some of these pieces.
Listen,
would have been
I could occupy this whole morning, this whole afternoon, this whole week with questions, but my time has expired. We'll have another round. Mr. Wiener, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question for the panel. Will the person who is in charge of the investigation raise their hand? Well, that was two hands and one flinch. Who is? No, that's a third hand.
I have authority for the investigation.
Okay, and Dr. Astaneh, why did you raise your hand if he's in charge? Yes, sir.
Dr. Astaneh, you want to respond?
I thought you asked, raise your hand if you were investigating.
No, I want to know who's in charge. Where does the buck stop on this panel, on this investigation? Oh, no one? Yes, sir.
No, I think it depends on when you ask your question or when you reference your question. NIST operates under the Federal Response Plan, where we provide technical support to the emergency agencies that have responsibility for the emergency. This would be FEMA primarily and the Corps of Engineers.
Dr. Bement, if you'll forgive me, I have a very brief amount of time. Are you in charge of the investigation into why the World Trade Center collapsed?
I now have authority to conduct this investigation, yes.
Okay, is that as of when?
Well, as of the concurrence of FEMA and the approval of the Secretary of Commerce.
Okay, so if you're in charge, are you empowered to sequester evidence?
Not under subpoena, but...
are you, that was going to be my next question, are you empowered to issue a subpoena requiring that someone turn over a building plan?
Not at this time.
Are you empowered to require someone to provide information if they might have it?
Not under any mandatory conditions, but we can request.
Do you have the ability to visit Ground Zero this morning, point to a piece of steel and say, I need you to save that?
I can do that, yes.
You have the power under the law to do that?
I think I can do that now, yes.
I'm sorry?
I think I can do that now.
You need to check with the member of your staff. What do you mean you think? Can you? Or can, it's not a this is an easy part, I thought.
Well, as I say, I don't have subpoena authority, and I have to work through FEMA, and I don't have control of the site.
Has anyone,
I have limited authorities.
Dr. Bement, has anyone...
And incidentally, just to take a second, again, we have to operate under the concurrence of local authority.
Well, I recall being on Beach 130th Street in Rockaway, watching the National Transportation Safety Board point to pieces of evidence, say to the local law enforcement, don't touch this or it's going to be a felony if you do. Do you have that authority?
That's exactly the authority I'm asking for in establishing a National Construction Safety Board that would have the same authorities as the National Transportation Safety Board.
Well, as you heard in my opening statement, I concur. Can I ask members of the panel, and I'm not sure, perhaps Dr. Corbett, if you were to look at a piece of steel that was affected in a catastrophic way, do we have the scientific ability to draw conclusions about what caused that piece of steel to fail? Dr. Corbett, I think I addressed it to you.
Okay. Yes, I think we do. Matter of fact, I know we do.
And might that piece of information be helpful in building future buildings?
Certainly.
Would you, Dr. Corbett, in looking at a bunch of steel that to me just might look like twisted steel, be able to say that given where this was in the building or what kind of a joint it was, this is more important than that?
Yes.
Has anyone on the panel been offered the opportunity to go take a look at the steel that came from that site to say, I want to study this one's less important? Has anyone in the panel, by a show of hands, had the ability to do that? Dr. Corley, the steel that is being recycled now by the city of New York, which is about 80% according to what I've been told, has that steel all been looked at by a member of a panel or a committee that is studying the causes of this disaster?
Not all of it has been looked at.
Are you concerned that what Dr. Corbett has just said to me, that you can look at a piece of steel, draw conclusions about it, and help prevent future accidents, that we have now lost irrevocably the opportunity to draw those conclusions?
That steel that has been recycled, we have lost any opportunity to do that. However, we have identified a large number of pieces of steel that will provide us with that type of information.
And if I can ask one further question, because now the yellow light is on to Dr. Bement. You said that we have the capability to determine the impact of heat on structural failure in buildings.
That's correct.
If we had done that type of analysis before September 11th, could we have drawn some conclusions about how long a building would withstand, a building like the World Trade Center would withstand the amount of heat and energy that was let loose in that building? Could we have said?
In principle, yes.
Okay, so we could have said and had written down somewhere that someone could have checked or referred to, you know what, this building has, based on this amount of energy being released, about 4 minutes.
That's correct.
Okay. Do you believe that if we had that information before September 11th, some of the people that are sitting behind you would not have lost loved ones?
Perhaps, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. Dr. Bement, when did the transition occur? When was the torch passed? Initially, we agree that in the final analysis, NIST should have the responsibility and you should have the resources to do what we expect you to do, but we're not aware that the torch had been passed from FEMA, which has first responsibility. When did this occur?
We've been in continuing consultation with FEMA over the past, well, since the event, as a matter of fact, and we've had discussions on how best NIST could serve in carrying out this investigation, and we've asked for concurrence not only from local authorities but also from FEMA, and you'll note from their letter they have supported our investigation. So we feel we have their complete support and authority to carry out the investigation.
But you are now officially in charge. Does FEMA agree with that? Officially in charge of the review and the preparation of the report?
Well, I would say that we're operating as if we're in charge, and I assume that we're in charge.
But does FEMA agree?
Mr. Chairman, I think the situation, to state it factually, is that we have a responsibility at FEMA to continue on through the production of this Building Performance Assessment Team report, which is scheduled for April. The results of that report, which, of course, the National Institute of Standards and Technology is a member of the team, will then be transmitted to NIST for their further examination. But they're currently partnering with us on that effort.
But would you, I mean, I think it's fair to say that for several months it's been uncertain who was clearly in charge.
I think that's an accurate statement.
And I think it's also fair to acknowledge that this was unprecedented. Well, Mr. Shays.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before you hit the dial, I'd love to just on behalf of Connecticut and New Jersey residents, just speak that we in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut all felt the impact of this. And the district I represent is 25 to 50 miles away. We have guests in our audience who lost loved ones. Grandparents were lost, parents, children, husbands, and wives. And we could see the smoke from our district, and turn on our TV and see our loved one and neighbors enclosed and cased in a building they couldn't get out of, that imploded before their very eyes. And I just, on behalf of them, thank you for having these hearings.
Thank you, Mr. Shays. Now the clock will start running.
Thank you. I'm kind of taken back by what's been said today, and also by the excellent questions of Mr. Weiner. He probably speaking a little loudly and a little quickly because he has 5 minutes, but his points are, I think, tell it all. I'm taken back, Mr. Shea, by your comment that no one thought these buildings would fall. And the fact that no one thought they would, but they did, would seem to me to be the very reason why we would have an investigation. I'm taken back by the fact that Mr. Bement, it's the worst building destruction in human history. So, you know, it's like nothing else needs to be said other than to wonder why this didn't happen sooner. And we all can look at ourselves, members of Congress. We were probably too focused on how do we deal with this war on terrorism than to deal with the mundane that needed to be dealt with right away. I'm interested to know why these buildings imploded rather than toppled. I'm interested to know if they had toppled, would there have been a domino effect, and would one building have triggered the fall of another, triggered the fall of another? And to me, these seem like very valid questions that have to be answered. And I'm interested, you focus, Mr. Ashin, you focused on the structure of the steel and didn't mention the fire, and Mr. Bement, you basically focused on the fire. Just with the structure of the steel, without the fire, would this building have collapsed?
No. In my opinion, the reason for collapse of building was because of softening and weakening of steel after the impact was done and the fire was going on.
But you showed the building when you took the plane away, but showed the damage, and you showed that basically some of the steel was just chopped.
Yes, but these structures, certainly these structures of World Trade Center, were designed in a very redundant way, which means if you take many members out, still the remaining members can redistribute the load and carry the remaining load. So even if you take few columns, in this case maybe 30%, 40% of columns were lost on one face of the building, the remaining columns were able to carry the load. If we did not have the fire, the buildings would stand up as they did for 1 hour.
When I was elected in '87, when Stuart McKinney passed away, at that very moment in time, we had the collapse of a lift slab structure in Bridgeport, and it imploded. You know, at one floor came down and then the others came down. Why didn't this building topple? And if it had toppled, would it have potentially knocked down other buildings?
The collapse that you mentioned, as well as collapse of World Trade Center, the eventual cause of most collapses is the gravity. Buildings are standing up because we have supports under the floors, and floors are supported on the columns. As soon as you remove the support, the gravity does the final damage and pulls the building down. In this case, because the fire damaged the columns and floors and softened them, the gravity is the cause that collapsed. That's why it's so vertically imploded and came down. To answer your question about whether or not it could be toppled, my own feeling initially was, and still is, that they may have tried, these terrorists, to actually topple the buildings, which would have been a disastrous event, toppling those structures on Wall Street area. But the structures were designed for very high level of storm, very high level of force, and 707.
Thank you. Mr. Corley,
airplane.
Do you agree with that?
Yes. Dr. Astaneh is correct in what he said, that it is the gravity that is the primary cause.
Is there ever a concern about a domino effect?
In most buildings, no. In low buildings, in very high seismic regions, you may have enough lateral load resistance in the building that they can topple. And I've seen a few buildings do that in very high seismic zones. These buildings generally will start to topple over, but then gravity will take over and come down. Building number 2 did, in fact, lean a fair amount, before it came down.
Just very quickly, my last question. Mr. Shea, I noticed you getting a little uneasy when Mr. Wiener was asking questions as to why Mr. Bement had the authority or not, and I was uneasy watching you, frankly, because it does strike me that 6 months after the fact, there shouldn't even have been any doubt. I mean, obviously, we have to deal with some statutory responsibilities and authority, but it sounds to me like you had the ability to give him power, and he says he took it and accepts it, but why wasn't it clearer?
Well, let me, if I can, try and characterize that for you. From day one, from the date of the disaster, when the President declared the disaster, FEMA had, and we undertook our responsibilities to conduct a building performance assessment. But I think the question was different. The question was who had the authority to investigate. We do not have authority to investigate. We do not have analogous authority to the NTSB or the FBI or other law enforcement types of agencies. But we did, and we continue to this day to have the authority to carry forward with the building performance assessment team. And it is when that report is completed in April that we intend to, in effect, pass the baton on. During the entire period of time, however, the American Society of Civil Engineers, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, they've all been partners in that effort. So if I was acting uncomfortable because I was concerned about the way the questions were being phrased versus the answers.
Thank you, Mr. Shea.
Thank you. And Mr. Shea, you have given a compelling argument for the need for an immediate development of a protocol so that we know clearly who's in charge.
Yeah.
That is absolutely essential. And the immediate question I have, it appears that FEMA didn't talk to city officials about preserving or documenting the steel that was being removed from the site. At least the city says FEMA never talked about them, which leads us to the Corley versus Corbett debate on what evidence was lost and how important it is to the overall investigation. Does FEMA play an active role in facilitating the investigation? It seems to me you do. So,
well, clearly, in terms of facilitating any assessment of the activity, the answer is yes. We do play a very pivotal role. On site, we have a federal coordinating officer and a disaster field office operation. They do interface on a daily basis with both state and local government as part of any effort that goes on at the disaster
didn't
site.
someone initially feel that with all this debris being hauled away, and we understand the necessity of doing that, but didn't someone think in terms of the investigation that would be conducted and the need for that material to be evidentiary?
I think the answer is yes, Chairman Boehlert. The day after the event, we began those discussions with the American Society of Civil Engineers and our prime contractor, Greenhorn and O'Meara, to field a building performance assessment team on the ground. So the answer is yes. I mean, we were considering it immediately in the aftermath.
Oh, we've been and I've read all this testimony and talked to a lot of people, and more importantly, listened to a lot of people.
Yes.
And the three impediments, and Dr. Astaneh pointed them out: the access to the site, the access to the material, and the blueprints. And it was like 4 months before anybody got the blueprints. This is a learning exercise.
Absolutely.
And we're all learning from what happened. Sure. And it's unprecedented, I understand. And we don't mean this to assume an adversarial role. We're all in this together. We're not here, sparring with you. We're just trying to get to the facts, to know what we need to know so that we'll know what we need to recommend so that something like this, one, will be prevented, but two, if it happens, we have the response capability that we need. Just before I go to Mr. Wiener, just let me ask you, who's that? Israel. Oh, Mr. Israel, you're next. I'm sorry, yeah. Wiener's sort of my buddy here. But do you feel, Mr. Shea, and do you feel, Dr. Bement, that you have the resources you need to this juncture to do what's expected of you? I know there are going to be requests for additional funds, but I want to make certain that nothing is being impeded, no progress is being delayed because you don't have whatever you need. Do you feel that FEMA has the resources it needs to do what you're expected to do right now?
The answer is yes, but I think it also needs to go back to some of the other issues that you raised, Mr. Chairman. The issues that we are now looking back on, that I think this committee is trying to address this afternoon, do need to be addressed as part of an overall strategy that the federal government will undertake. It's my opinion, based on my experience, that is properly then vested in the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the kinds of authorities that Dr. Bement has outlined to you this afternoon. In terms of conducting our business, what we were undertaking with the Building Performance Assessment Team, yes, we have sufficient resources to do that.
And how about you, Dr. Bement?
Well, there are three phases to this overall study, which by itself is going to take almost 24 months. There's a preliminary stage which we have been active at the present time. We have the resources necessary to set the stage and get the necessary concurrences and to also obtain the materials that are available for metallurgical examination forensic study. There's a study itself, and Dr. Corley's estimate of what the resources required for that study are very close to the mark.
Where do the resources come for Dr. Corley's study? Does it come from FEMA?
They were a combination of resources that the American Society of Civil Engineers put into the process,
right,
along with funding from FEMA.
All right, so you haven't had to put any resources into the BPAT yet? You've participated?
No, I'm talking about resources that would have to support the consortium that NIST is organizing at the present time to carry on the full-scale study that we've been talking about. Those recommendations have gone up to the highest level of the administration, and I'm very optimistic that will be resolved very quickly. The third phase, which will go in parallel with the investigation itself, is to take the lessons learned and provide the technical basis for changes in codes and standards, not only for existing buildings but for new construction, to provide better security for occupants, to provide better egress, to provide better structural integrity under these types of impacts.
Well, they're going to be a request, obviously, but the bottom line is you feel you have what you need in terms of resources, maybe transfer.
I don't think we've slowed down. We've got a team going. We've been coordinating with FEMA and other agencies. I think we're ready to go, and I think the resources.
And there will be no hesitancy to request additional resources.
There will be no hesitancy. That's correct.
All right, that's
and
good.
Furthermore, I would say that we will build on the current BPAT study, which will be issued in April. But we have some of the results already, so we can, as I say.
And you're not waiting for that study to do. All right, fine. Mr. Israel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to follow up on some of these questions regarding the resources that have been made available for these studies. To the Chairman's question, Mr. Shea, who used to be in charge of the investigation, said we have enough. Dr. Bement, who I understand is now in charge of the investigation, says we may have enough depending on these phases. Dr. Corley says we need $40 million, and until we have $40 million, it's not enough. Can somebody explain to me exactly what it's going to take to do the kind of study we need to do to make sure that this doesn't occur in the future? Let's start with Dr. Bement.
Well, I think Dr. Corley was estimating what the cost of a study of this type would require, and as I say, he's pretty close to the mark. We've developed
40 million.
I won't put a number on it just yet.
The mark, I believe, is 40 million. What's close to the mark?
No, that was his estimate.
Okay.
I'm just saying it's not too far out of the ballpark.
Okay.
Now, we are working on a funding plan, and that will come forward very quickly. As far as the investigation, it's a question of what you mean by the investigation. If you're talking about the technical investigation, which NIST is proposing doing, I'm operating on the assumption that I have adequate authority to begin that technical investigation. If you're talking about broader issues with regard to responsibility and other ancillary items surrounding the World Trade Center collapse, which we're not going to be involved in, that's not in our camp at the present time.
Dr. Bement, you stated that at this hearing that NIST has received policy approval for this study. What does policy approval mean?
It means that Under 15 U.S. Code paragraph 281A, which the chairman referred to, it gives us the authority to, on our own initiative, but only after consultation with local authorities, we may initiate and conduct investigations to determine the causes of structural failures.
Dr. Bement, I'm sorry, I also have limited time. I'm getting kind of a bureaucratic response. What does policy approval mean, and how much is it going to cost to do what you have to do?
That's our policy approval right there. That gives me the authority to do, with consultation and with adequate resources, to carry out the investigation.
Adequate resources. Dr. Corley, what does $40 million get us that we're not getting right now?
The work that would be done with the $40 million would be to follow up on the many recommendations that will be coming out in our report, where further study and, in some cases, research programs are needed to get answers to the questions. It would cover the issues of protection of the emergency response teams, as well as structural and fire issues.
So you believe that the expenditure of $40 million would cover virtually everything we need to know about what went wrong and prevent other things from going wrong in the future?
Well, with any research, you never know what you're going to find, so there may be things that would require more than that, but this is what I would judge is needed at this point.
That's your benchmark, and Dr. Bement has said that you're close to the mark. And my final question to Mr. Shea, can you tell us approximately how much FEMA has expended up to this point on these investigations?
Yeah, our investment to date is about $600,000.
$600,000. We need to get to $40 million. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. The chair will now yield to Dr. Ehlers, who's going to assume the chair momentarily for his questioning.
Never realized one could become chairman of this committee that quickly. It's a pleasure to have you all here, and I want to pursue the line of questioning that you just heard. As I understand, when you say policy approval, Dr. Bement, that means you also have the authority to spend the money needed to do it. Is that correct?
I have no statutory authority to spend that kind of money at the present time.
Okay, then the next question is, where's the money going to come from? And that, let me also say, Mr. Shea, I'm going to hit you on this too. We're talking $40 million. That's not just the study. That's also following up, as you said, Dr. Corley. And I presume by that means follow-up studies on determining the nature of progressive collapse, which was responsible not only for the towers collapsing, but I understand also for a good deal of the damage done in Oklahoma City disaster as well. Now, does your estimate of $40 million, Dr. Corley, include further studies on progressive collapse, further studies on fire damage to steel structures and so forth, or is that not part of your recommendation?
Yes, that would include all of the subjects that I have mentioned, plus those that have been brought up in the other testimony.
Well, I personally think that's money well spent, and the nation as a whole would save a lot of money if that's done. The question is, where's the money going to come from? I know, Dr. Bement, because I have jurisdiction over NIST in my subcommittee, you don't have the money to do it.
That's correct.
Now, Mr. Shea, you have a substantial amount of money, which is given as part of the money that the Congress approved last year to deal with it. How much of your money are you dedicating to this effort, both the initial work and also the ongoing study? In other words, do you have enough money to fund the $40 million that we're talking about here?
No, the direct answer is we do not. The funding that was provided to us is really for the relief of victims and for rebuilding the community and to pay for police, fire, that kind of thing. The Stafford Act would not encompass these types of long-term studies. And if we were to undertake them like anybody else in the federal government, we'd have to go through a process with the administration to request them.
So you have no funding for research?
Well, realistically, we have some small pockets of funding that relate to flood-related issues, seismic-related issues, dam safety issues, but those are all very specifically authorized kinds of things that we do. The amount of funding there is relatively small, comparatively speaking.
And where did you get the money for this initial study that's been done?
The initial assessment comes out of the Disaster Relief Fund because it is, again, scope limited. It's important to understand the whole effort is designed to provide a basis for rebuilding with mitigation incorporated as part of that overall mitigation process, rebuilding process, so that it's part of the overall relief and recovery effort.
But you've asked NIST to take over the formal investigation, but you're not sending the money along with that request. Is that what you're saying?
Well, we think it's an excellent idea to have an investigation, a longer-term investigation of these issues based on our experience in these areas. But no, we would not send funding to go with it.
However, the Congress passed a provision that part of that $6 billion you received could be used for that. Would you send the money along with it then?
If Congress and the administration agreed on a principle like that, they sure. I mean, that, absolutely, yes.
Okay. That's certainly one solution. Dr. Bement, as I said earlier, I know you don't have the money. That's not quite accurate. You do have it, but it would do incredible damage to NIST if all of that money came out of your budget. And so clearly the money has to come from somewhere.
Right.
Is the administration considering at all including this as part of its supplemental request to the Congress, which I understand is coming out in a week or two?
I believe that is a consideration, yes. I can't say that that's the avenue they'll finally decide on, but I know that they're considering that.
And Mr. Shea, pinning down a little more, when you say you have no authority, are you talking about no statutory authority or no budget authority to send money at this point? And demand as well.
We do not have statutory authority to conduct these types of investigations, and obviously then we wouldn't have the attendant resource base associated with that.
And NIST has a statutory authority, but you're saying not the budget authority at this point.
The mechanism that's in the statute is deficient in terms of providing the funding and providing the mechanisms to get an appropriate response, technical response on the site immediately. And,
well, I have
covered that ground.
I have a couple of worries here. First of all, there's a lot of this going on in terms of funding, and we and the administration have to come to some agreement on where the money is going to come from. My other concern is involving the academic community, which you see represented here and which has a very good background. The National Science Foundation actually was a first on the ground with investigators and has done this regularly in cases like this. I'm very concerned that we, as an administration and a Congress, provide sufficient funds for NIST to do what it does so extremely well. But I think it's also important that we provide funding for the university community to participate. Now, that either would come through NSF or, I understand, Dr. Bement, you also can give grants to...
Well, we will bring universities into our study.
You will include
we will fund
them.
that work.
And that would be part of your funding as well.
That's correct.
All right. I think we've clarified that problem, but it's clear that we have to do more work on it. Otherwise, we'll have grand plans for grand studies, and not only in finding out what happened here, but also how to prevent it in the future, both in terms of fire and progressive collapse damage. And if we're not careful, and by we, I include the Congress and the administration, it just won't be done. So I hope that all of us in Congress will keep everyone's feet to the fire and make sure we get this job done. I yield back my time. Next, we call on Mr. Etheridge from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me thank you and the chairman of our committee for having this hearing that's so important, not only to the people in New York, but the people in this country, and I think ultimately around the world, because this is, we've seen a lot of things happen, and I think it's not only important just to the families of victims of the 9/11 tragedy, but it's important to all of us to learn as much as we can at this date about the collapse of the World Trade Center buildings. Aside from withstanding enormous wind loads, the World Trade Center towers were also constructed to withstand settlement loads. Because the towers, as you know, I don't need to remind any of you, was built on a landfill. And it went down, and they had to go down and do bedrock and all the stuff that took place. As I remember, it was about 70 feet below ground level, I think, that it wound up going down. Although the towers were, in fact, designed to withstand being struck by an airplane, no one ever envisioned what ultimately happened on September the 11th. They weren't able to survive the effects of a direct hit with all the gasoline. And I know you've been talking about that already with the collapse of floors and the pancaking, etc. And I, like others, have been there and was horrified at what I saw. In trying to comprehend how this happened, that the loads just collapsed, is there any reason to have concern on how other tall buildings are constructed in this country and the safety of the people that are occupying them? Who would like to take that on?
Congressman, I'm not an engineer. I'm probably the only person at this table that isn't an engineer. But I would say the answer to your question is yes. There should be some concern. And I think the notion of a longer-term investigation should help answer some of those questions about whether and what we can do about that. But again, I don't think we have the answers this afternoon.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I think that's the critical point here, is that there are other high-rise buildings in this country, and we need to understand exactly what happened at the World Trade Center and learn from it and apply it to other buildings. I mean, this is a fire, you know, planes hit the building, but it was a fire that brought it down, and we need to understand that.
One of the important things is that until now, structures are designed by structural engineers. Then they're passed to fire engineers to design the fireproofing, but there's no interaction. I think it's very important that for future we come up with joint work of fireproofing engineers as well as structural engineers. And I think the NIST plan is very good in that sense, that it will bring in fire engineers and structural engineers. But to answer your question directly, I think yes, we have a lot of concerns about all other tall buildings.
Thank you. One additional question, if I may, because that brings on the second question with all the different agencies we now have looking at it. And as we go forward, because I remember in your earlier testimony as you were talking, almost each one of you were talking about data that may have been lost because of a number of issues not having been protected, etc. Because we have so many involved. What are we doing now to protect that data? And what are we doing of laying out a plan so that we, God forbid we should ever have something like this again, at least we've got a plan in place that, number one, we protect the integrity of the information, but number two, we've got a plan working to make sure that we don't have the kind of problems we've had with this one.
Congressman, I'll attempt to begin the answer to that question. I guess I would point out a couple things. One is FEMA is working with the team from the American Society of Civil Engineers to preserve whatever data is available, and that is, in fact, also being shared with the National Institute of Standards and Technology. As was testified earlier, they are receiving some of this steel that was called as part of that effort. Further, FEMA and the National Institute of Standards and Technology has begun discussions of a preliminary mechanism by which we could do better in the future, and a memorandum of understanding about a quick response mechanism. But I think there's a more fundamental question here about how do we effectively coordinate all the science-based agencies in responding to events of this kind. I'm not sure we have the answers to that this afternoon, but I think it is a fair issue for the committee to address.
Representative Etheridge, I would answer this way, that clearly is part of our investigation. We don't have to wait to the end of the investigation to have findings and recommendations with regard to those aspects. And we would certainly consult with this committee very quickly once we have such a plan in hand.
Thank you. And if I may, Mr. Chairman, I would encourage you to move along, to work through your association and others, because as other buildings are being built, seems to me to be most appropriate to work through every avenue we have to not only shore up the ones we now have, but those that are being built for safety and for fire safety as well. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Grucci.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening this hearing today. The information has been pretty helpful so far. I just been listening to the debate going back and forth about the dollar values for the study. Is it enough? Isn't it enough? Who has it? Who doesn't have it? And I hope that we can work that out very quickly. But Mr. Shea, and this is not an attack against you, it's just something that I heard in your statement early on when you indicated that it'll take years to complete these studies. And I would encourage all that's going to be part of this is that we can't wait years. There are people out there who need answers now, not only those that are sitting in this room, but the thousands of others whose lives have been torn apart as a result of this tragedy. In addition to those folks, I know that this Congress won't wait years. I know this congressperson won't wait years. We want answers. We need answers. And we would hope and encourage you all to move quickly in this. Let's weed through who doesn't have and who does have the authority, and let's all get on the same team and get to the end results, because as Mr. Etridge said, there are buildings going up that can use the benefit of the knowledge that'll come out of these hearings and come out of the study that you'll do. If you need money, I can't promise you that you'll get it all, but I can promise you that we're going to be here to work with you to get this thing resolved, because as the chairman said, this is not an attack against you. We're all here to work together. My question goes pretty much to trying to at least assemble in my mind what happened from what I'm hearing here today. And gleaning through the information that you all provided in your testimony, and I too have had the opportunity to read it, one thing came clear to me, that it wasn't the elongated fire from the fuel of the jet planes that created the extreme heat that indeed may have had or may not have had direct results on the tensile strength of the steel, causing the building to collapse. Because as I understood it from my reading, is that the jet fuel probably burnt off between 10 to 15 minutes after the impact of the jet into the building. What caused the intense heat and the massive fires was that jet fuel as a first fire, causing the rest of the floors where that jet fuel came into contact with to catch fire, and desks and chairs and rugs and whatever else may have been in the building then started to burn as the fuel. And I understand that there was a fair amount of floors that were involved with that. The question that I have is if indeed it was not the jet fuel that was the main culprit, and that did indeed burn itself off in a reasonable time, fast enough where it didn't affect the strength of the steel, and that the secondary fires caused the problem, why wouldn't the fire suppression system that should have been, or was in the building, I shouldn't say should have been, it was in the building, why didn't they function on the floors that may not have come into direct contact with the jet craft, that may have taken out the pipes and the suppression systems? And I think well, whoever wants to try to answer that, please do.
Okay, I'll take the first stab at that. It's our belief that the water source for the sprinkler system was compromised, and there was no water that was supplied to the system after the planes hit. Nothing above the floors that were hit.
But the floors beneath where it hit would still have had water?
They would have had water, but there was really no fire. Well, there was only a small amount of fire there, and some of those fires were controlled even with handheld firefighting equipment.
And so the fires that were the secondary fires, if you will, as a result of the jet fuel, were on the floors above where the plane impacted?
Yes, that's correct.
How would that have happened? Why wouldn't it have? I was always under the impression, listening to the stories and reading in the papers, what you can glean from that, is that the jet fuel migrated its way down through the building, through the corridors, through the elevator shafts, through whatever orifice was in the building to allow the fuel to migrate down. How did it go up?
Well, to answer the first part of that question, yes, there was some fuel that went down, but those fires, based on the photos we have, did not spread widely. Some of them were put out by people on those floors. The fire above, first of all, the plane took out parts of the floors and opened up the building, knocked out a lot of the windows so that the fire could go up from floor to floor that way, and there probably was damage to the floors that also allowed it to progress up through the building.
And so the suppression systems then did work for the floors beneath it?
There was probably, well, yes, there was not a great deal of fire beneath the areas where the planes went in, as far as we can tell.
I'll just add a couple comments. As far as the suppression systems go, it's very likely that when the plane went through the building, we certainly know it took out the stairwells, and that's where the supply pipes for the sprinkler systems are located, so it just sheared right through them. So that would have allowed basically a flood of water to come out. As far as lower incidents within the building, and we do know that I actually have a student in one of my classes as a security guard in Tower 1 and was there when the jet fuel came down the elevator shaft and blew off the doors and started a fire down there. I know from another person that I know as an architect went through the lobby and saw the sprinkler system actually going off in the lobby and was wondering why, and I think that's probably the reason to answer that.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair would, the intention of the chair is as follows. We have 12 minutes to go in terms of the current vote, and there's only one vote, so we'll have to recess briefly. The chair will recognize Mr. Israel for 1 minute to make an announcement, then Mr. Larson for his questions, and then we'll temporarily recess to go over to answer the vote, and then we'll be right back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, let me again thank you for your bipartisan leadership in bringing us to a focused and sensible approach to this issue. One recurring theme is what we're going to invest as a nation in the type of evaluation that's going to improve the safety of both the public and emergency responders in the event of another building collapse. Dr. Corley estimates a total of $40 million. Dr. Bement says that he's near the mark. NIST has asked for $2 million, or allocated $2 million. FEMA has already expended about $500,000. We want to support your efforts. We want to make sure that you have everything you need so that we can evaluate and make sure that this doesn't happen again. In that vein, I'm pleased to announce that under the Chairman's leadership, Congressman Wiener and I have co-signed a letter to Budget Director Mitch Daniels asking him to provide you with all the funding that you require for the type of comprehensive evaluation that's going to make sense. Again, Chairman Boehlert has signed this letter, Congressman Wiener has signed the letter, and I would invite all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to co-sign this with us. This is once again going to be an issue of budget priorities, and I can think of no more important budget priority than to spend what's needed to evaluate and make sure.
And I would encourage all of our colleagues to sign that letter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me add to the chorus of those thanking you for conducting this hearing, and let me also second the proposal of my colleague and join in the signing of this and commend the Skyscraper Safety Campaign for their efforts here, and point out, as my colleague from Connecticut has, the number of people from Connecticut in the audience today, and specifically Monica Gabriel, who lost her husband Richard at the World Trade Center. The questions that have been raised by my colleagues, I think, draw down to a specific point. I believe it was Thomas Friedman who indicated that since when we look at the tragedy of September the 11th and we look at what happened, in many respects, it was a failure of imagination, and a failure of imagination that evolves around a sense agencies, so much so that even as Mr. Wiener and others have asked their questions today, the American public has to look at a specter of the right hand not knowing what the left hand is doing. Now, obviously, there's plenty of blame, I guess, that can go around, and our object here is not to lay blame, but to get to answers and solutions. But at the heart of my concern is one that's been raised, I think, by a number of people, and that's that since September 11th, perhaps we know more than we have, but we're no better prepared to address the concerns of the future. And we're no better prepared because of these turf battles and the stovepiping that persists. So my question is, in general, and the President, and I believe wisely so, has appointed
Tom Ridge, the head of Homeland Security. And as we look to specific appropriations, and as we look, and it's been cited here frequently, for specific statutory authority, do we need one central clearinghouse? The dominant theme amongst every group that I've spoken to since September the 11th is the need for commonality of communication, interoperability, and the ability for on-site control. In your estimation, and I know this is you're at the beginning process, is that what this nation needs to move forward? And how do we, and how are you going to be successful in all the information that you're gathering if you can't overcome those hurdles? And I'll start with you, Dr. Bement.
I think there does have to be a central authority that can go in and carry out an investigation and can sequester all the evidence that's necessary to carry out that investigation immediately after the collapse occurs or whatever the event is.
Do you think that Mr. Ridge should be that authority? Do you think that we should have someone that can bring all the federal agencies and state agencies and local municipalities to focus and bear on this issue?
Well, I wouldn't want to say that that would be the only way it could be done, but certainly it ought to be considered.
Dr. Corbett?
And certainly an answer to that question. We need it. We don't have it right now. We don't have a coordinated response to disaster investigations, in my opinion.
What would be the best place for that to reside? Would it be...
Well, I suggested FEMA because they have a responsibility for disaster response and mitigation is what we're talking about here. Mitigating the future, mitigating issues that perhaps we're going to find in other high-rise buildings. For
Mr. Shea?
My reaction is that the best way to approach this is to vest that authority and responsibility in a single federal agency. In this case, my testimony is that would be the National Institute of Standards and Technology.
So, and it was someone from the National Institutes of Technology want to respond? And this is what the American public sees.
No, let me give you a direct response to your question. I think where it comes to structural collapse and anything that brings together fire and structural collapse, NIST would certainly be an appropriate agency to have that responsibility directly. As long as all the mechanisms are in place, and if we can set up the necessary board structure so that all the parties that might be involved, including local and state authorities, can be on the scene immediately, and that there are necessary subpoena powers in order to gather information and evidence.
We have a very serious problem here, and it seems to me every time we discuss this, and there's increasing frustration in Congress at all levels, that when we talk to the bureaucracy responsible for this, we get the Abbott and Costello line of who's on first.
The gentleman's,
and it just goes on and on.
The gentleman's time has expired. In all fairness, I think it's very important, and this committee prides itself on working together. It's very important to understand and appreciate that this is something unprecedented in the history of mankind. And what we're trying, there's clear authority if there's a hurricane, if there's a flood, if there's an airplane crash, there's clear authority for various agencies to come in. This is something where we're sort of plowing new ground, and it's very important, as the testimony indicates, that we design a protocol so that we'll know instantly if something, God forbid, like this ever happens again. We've got people on site, in charge, action initiated. With that, the chair recognizes Mrs. Morella, and she has 4 minutes and 40 seconds before we have to go vote.
Okay, I'll talk really fast. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this hearing. And I do want to also reflect the fact that to the families of the victims who are here, I offer my condolences, prayers, and this is one of the reasons why we have this hearing. Thank you, gentlemen, for your presentations. And I know the chairman will allow us to submit some questions to you, too, because we have more questions that we haven't gotten to. I wanted to pick up Dr. Bement. I know you're getting a lot of questions here, and welcome at the helm of the National Institute of Standards and Technology. But some of the important research that's been mentioned here today is going to seems to require a large-scale testing facility. To what extent are NIST laboratories equipped to do that kind of work, to carry on that kind of work? In other words, are you going to need some additional facilities for this? And if so, what would their capabilities be, and what would it cost?
Well, as you know, this is an unprecedented event.
Yeah.
It's probably the first time where, on this scale, structural dynamics and fire dynamics have come together to create an initiating event that created a catastrophe. That's an area where we do need to do research. We need to do research at an appropriate scale so that we can understand the fire response of building materials and building structures. And I can say that we do not have that kind of a facility at the present time.
So that's something that we're going to have to factor into what happens after the report, is to look at that, because I certainly don't want to see cannibalization of the other research that's being done, at NIST, and I know you don't either.
I appreciate
So,
that.
Mr. Chairman, you're going to have to look at the facility for this, too, after that.
The angel of NIST has spoken. Are you going to be coming back? Because we have to take a brief recess now. Because when we come back, the time will be yours, Mrs. Morella.
Well,
but we've only have 2 minutes and 30 seconds, and unless you can run faster than me, we're going to have difficulty getting over there.
Fine, thank you. I will try to.
And I should have mentioned previously that
Thank
after the opening statements by all the witnesses, the statement from the Skyscraper Safety Committee will be in the record for all to see and to consider. We will take a brief recess. We'll get back as quickly as we can. You can have a pause, a break in the act. Members are making their way back from the floor. The chair is pleased to recognize Ms. Sheila Jackson-Lee for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to add my appreciation to you for holding this very important hearing. I don't think any of us who live in communities, regardless of whether they're urban or rural, could express ourselves in watching the tragic incidences of September 11th. And to be able to find solutions, I think, is a key element to what this hearing is all about. Having visited Ground Zero in the early stages and knowing what my New York colleagues have been through and how much they have fought so hard for finding a remedy to September 11th, I think this hearing may begin to be part of the healing. And I, too, offer my deepest sympathy and as well expression of concern to those who were victims of that terrible and tragic day. To the families, I expressly offer my deepest sympathy. I realize that we've had a long hearing, but I am looking at today's New York Times article. And in reviewing this article, I am noting in particular that the first paragraph announces the adoption of new national standards for the construction of public and governmental buildings to make them more resilient or resistant to catastrophic failures in the event of terrorist attacks. It notes that the leader of the investigation into the World Trade Center's collapse and the director of the federal agency that evaluates major fires and building failures are calling for such standards. Now, I have listened to my colleagues. I've reviewed some of the testimonies in terms of the presented testimonies. I do apologize for being at another hearing at the same time, but I want to pointedly ask the question, based upon this article, is it true that we are calling for the adoption of such? And are you advocating for these standards to be federalized, as many of us realize that we have little input at this point? I would also like to find out how does the present standard systems or the present system works, and who is responsible for oversight and implementation. I'm also aware that there are many private groups, societies of engineers and others that have a great deal of impact on the design of buildings. and may also have a great deal, with all due respect to the professions, with interfering with the creation of new standards. So I guess if I can start with some of the representatives here, Dr. Bement, Dr. Corley, are we today at this hearing calling for new standards? Have you called for them in this hearing? And are they to be federal standards? That'd be my first. And I have two other questions, and I'd like to, I'm looking at the light, be able to at least have them raised before the time runs out.
I would say that right now we don't have the technical basis for new standards. We have a compelling incident. The compelling incident has to be backed up with technical investigation and evaluation, so we need the technical basis that will go to new standards development. Now, standards development and code development in this country is done by a consensus process through various code development organizations, and there are at least two organizations, the ICC and the Federal Fire Protection Agency, that issues a number of model codes that are used throughout the country by local authorities to fashion their own codes for their own region. NIST provides some of the technical basis for those model code developments, but we're by far not the only source of technical information that goes into the development of those codes.
So that wouldn't be you that the New York Times is speaking of, that you were calling for new federal standards. We're going to announce them today?
And that's correct.
You believe there needs to be a consensus?
I believe, first of all, we need to develop the technical basis, and that's the purpose of our investigation. So we will be working very closely with the code development organizations.
Let me ask Dr. Corley then, as my time runs out. Were you prepared to call for new federal standards today and have recommend those adoption of such?
No, I am not. It is premature to call for changes. Once the work that I have referred to that I believe needs to be done has been completed, and as it gets completed, there may indeed be things that come up that need to be considered by the standards writing groups and may change the existing standards through the processes just mentioned. But it is premature at this point to pinpoint any one item and say that this is ready to be changed. And under no circumstances do I feel that the processes that are currently in place should be changed. They work well and should continue.
Chairman, can I raise these additional questions for the record minimally, and maybe someone can give me a yes or no? I think they're quick enough to give a yes or no.
If you can get the yes or no within a minute.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Corley, in particular, you were involved in the Oklahoma investigations, I understand, and made several recommendations. I guess the question would be, and I imagine the families would want to hear, how quickly government can move. My question is, were those recommendations implemented? That can be a yes or no. And then finally, is any recommendations made for improving building codes, emergency responses and evaluation? Are any of those being made? What are the obstacles to making changes in the codes? I think that needs to be answered today by those who've been victimized by this very tragic incident. Were any of your recommendations taken in, yes or no?
The ones we made were yes.
They were taken in.
Thank you. The lady is very skillfully.
Thank you, and I will put the other ones in writing, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your kindness.
She's very adroit at doing that. And we're going to have another round, so Sheila, don't go away. We're here to stay. Mr. Smith.
Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. And thank the witnesses for being so diligent and patient over the last 2.5, 3 hours. My first question, of course, bin Laden was a construction engineer. And just wondering, Mr. Shea, Dr. Astaneh, or whoever else, as a pilot and talking to other friends that are pilots, wondered the preciseness of that apparent accident. Other pilots, and I can agree, that these pilots were very good flyers to fly at that speed and hit that target. And I'm curious to put it on the record if maybe it was on purpose hitting it at that particular height. What would have happened if the plane hit in the top 2 stories or down in the bottom 6 stories?
If the planes had hit at the upper levels, top 10 stories, most likely we will not have this tragedy. I feel that you will have burned floors at the top. You could rescue people underneath and then later cut those floors and have a 100-story building. If they had hit the lower part of building, you would not have the collapse again because the plane could not enter as intact as it did. The columns there are very strong, very thick, and most likely the plane will be shattered, as I showed in my example analysis, and the fuel will be outside. I don't know if they did it on purpose, but they really hit the worst part where the plane could enter and cause the fire, and there was enough weight above the floors that they hit to collapse it under gravity.
Would you agree, Mr. Shea?
Yes, absolutely. There's no question in my mind that there was an attempt made on this building in 1993. It failed. They spent the next 8 years figuring out how to do it.
I chair the subcommittee on research that has oversight for the National Science Foundation, and Dr. Corley, Dr. Bement, NSF has, well, they've done a lot with the nanotechnology that we've developed in our research to help search up there in those facilities. But I'm wondering, it's my understanding that NSF now has 8 teams out studying. And Dr. Corley, Dr. Bement, how are the data collected by NSF and these funded researchers being utilized in both of your studies?
Well, I can answer that they will be fully utilized in our study. Most investigators funded by the NSF would publish their results in the open literature, and they would generally make available any of their the results of their work. We would certainly want to have the full availability.
Do you have some process or some organization that you're now inquiring and utilizing that in your studies, or is it just going to be, if something, is it informal?
No, our study will be fully inclusive. We'll use all sources of expertise that are...
But you haven't so far?
We are in very close contact with NSF, and of course we are participating in the American Society for Civil Engineering study, the BPAS study, and I imagine that some of the results of the NSF studies are being utilized in that phase of the investigation.
Corley.
Yes, I might, if I could start by referring to bin Laden. My understanding his degree is not in engineering, and I do not have the opinion that if it was studied exactly where to hit it, that he was the one that made the final decision on that. As far as
why is that?
His degree was not in. It's in public administration, I believe. He's not an engineer, to the best of my knowledge.
But in terms of, you would conclude that it wasn't him that made the decision.
I don't think he would have the knowledge to make that decision. In regard to your question about utilization of information, we are utilizing everything we can get our hands on, and the NSF was instrumental in putting together a workshop in December where researchers working on this did exchange information, so we were able to get some of it at that time, and we of course look for all the ways we can to get it.
Dr. Astaneh, do you agree?
I wish we had more cooperation with other teams and utilize our results as well as data. So far, I've done my research just based on data that I've collected myself, and I have not been able to have data from other teams, including drawings and other information that could be very useful to my research.
Will NIST be using Dr. Astaneh's steel that he collected as far as the evaluation and analysis?
We have it now, or at least we have the initial samples. And we have more coming, so I don't know piece by piece where his is at the present
shortly.
time.
Dr. Astaneh, you had just...
I hope that these studies that NIST is proposing will involve study of pieces that I have collected and others, as well as involvement from whole community of academia who are doing research.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'll look forward to the second
Thank you very much. Dr. Bartlett.
Thank you very much. Clearly, we need to understand the engineering of what happened here, of this failure. I just signed on to a letter asking for additional money so that this can be properly done. I'm really somewhat amazed that you were excluded from the site. Clearly, understanding what happened there so that we could better design buildings to prevent this sort of a tragedy in the future should have been of the prime objective. I hope that you can get the information you need, even though you've been excluded from the site and still haven't got the drawings and so forth. I'd just like to ask a question about where we go from here. Clearly, the most inviting terrorist targets are where there are a lot of people closely pressed together. If it's a chemical attack, the more people that are in close confines, the better. If it's a biological attack, the more people are going to be affected. If it's a bomb, the more people are going to be affected. If it's an event like this, the more people are going to be affected. In today's world with mass communication, with computers, with teleconferencing, this information travels, what, 186,000 miles a second? It doesn't take very long to get from Manhattan to a cornfield in Omaha. Help me understand why it's a good idea to build more skyscrapers that are just more inviting targets for terrorists. Yes, sir.
I would think it's the human spirit.
If you're building them for pride of ownership, I understand that. If it's the equivalent of going to the moon, I understand that. But in terms of being concerned about protection of people and fighting terrorism and so forth, I'm having some problems understanding why bringing more people together in close confines and building skyscrapers with all the communication techniques. Now, that started when we didn't have the kind of communication capabilities we have today. I'm having trouble understanding why it's a good idea today to keep on building skyscrapers.
If I may respond briefly to that, it's and this is a personal opinion, the city is not a city without tall buildings. If you have all one-story buildings, all you have is urban sprawl. You have no city.
Washington's not a city?
But Washington does have some
not very tall buildings. No.
So my belief is that it is appropriate to design the tall buildings, and I would also point out that it's not just tall buildings that are the target. The Pentagon was not a tall building.
That is correct, and the damage inflicted by the plane that hit the Pentagon was orders of magnitude less than the planes that hit those buildings simply because it was not a tall building, which makes my argument that I'm having some trouble understanding why it's a good idea to build more tall buildings. Yes, sir.
May I add one comment? What we have done is we have gone up and up over the last century or so without looking into the fact that you cannot expand everything without limit. There's a size effect in everything, in all our engineering work, that when you get to a certain size, you have to change the concept that you are using. We have unfortunately added up these floors without looking at the fact that you cannot reach upper floors for firefighting, and you cannot really protect them against airplanes and other aspects. I think it does not answer your question directly. I apologize for that. But I think what we have missed and did not pay attention is that in our effort to build tall buildings, we have not paid attention to protecting them.
I'm personally uncomfortable in a building that can't be reached by the longest ladder on a ladder truck. I know that you rely on other things than those tall buildings, but I still repeat my initial question. Our society has been changed. The world we live in has been changed. And I would submit that one of the things we ought to consider is whether it's in fact a good idea to build these inviting terrorist targets in the future. They're good targets for biological warfare. They're good targets for chemical warfare. They're certainly good targets for bombing and this sort of thing. And I'm just, we just need to stop and rethink what we're doing, and is that the right thing to be doing in the future? And I would question whether building more skyscrapers is in fact in our national security interest in the future. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, and we're welcoming as a guest in the committee, but an interested guest, Mr. Crowley of New York.
Firstly, let me thank the chairman for allowing me to sit on the committee today and for holding this hearing. I come to this committee hearing with mixed emotions because I have over 105 families who lost loved ones on the September 11th, and We have members of the Ashton family who are here today who lost their son Tom at 21 years of age. I also lost my first cousin, Battalion Chief John Moran, and I knew at least 7 people intimately very well. So I have, again, mixed emotions, but recognizing the need to hold these hearings. Once again, I commend you, Mr. Chairman, for taking on this responsibility. I have a number of questions that I think I would address to Mr. Shea, Mr. Corley, and Mr. Bement firstly. And one, can any one of you gentlemen tell me who was in charge of amassing the steel and other debris as a result from the attack of September 11th on the World Trade Center?
I'm not sure I understand fully your question.
In other words, what entity was in charge of collecting the material?
FEMA commissioned the Building Performance Assessment Team, and it was that team led by Dr. Corley that would have embraced that responsibility.
Did they determine which debris would be sold off as scrap? And if not, who did?
Yeah, I'll defer to Dr. Corley on that.
No, we did not determine that. That was determined, I understand, by the City of New York.
When did you become aware that the steel from the World Trade Center was being sold off?
I think it was on the order of a week or so before we arrived on site on October the 5th, I believe it was.
So in other words, the city was selling or was disposing of material within 2 weeks of the actual event, or was it prior to that?
It may have been prior to that. I'm not sure when the first decision was made on that, but I didn't find out. We didn't find out.
Were you disturbed by that? By finding that out? Were you disturbed to find out that the city was actually disposing of or selling off
we had
material?
previously indicated that we definitely wanted to see the steel and select
Did you or did FEMA or any other entity actually ask or tell the City of New York to cease and desist from disposing of that material?
As far as the team is concerned, we made it known that we needed steel, and I don't have any knowledge that anyone had the authority even to ask them to cease and desist.
So no one even asked them politely to stop selling, but in all likelihood could be evidence, Mr. Astaneh?
I believe I was the first one to find out that the steel is being recycled. New York Times reporter Jim Glantz told me 2 weeks after a collapse, and I tried to contact city, and also New York Times reporters tried to make sure we can have access to steel to do the research. It was not happening, and I went myself, directly contacted the recycling plant and made arrangement. Through their cooperation, I started work there and collected the steel, and later, 2 weeks later, I believe, ASCE team came also, and they started their work.
Mr. Corley, you said that no significant loss occurred, or no significant difference, I think was the word you used.
Yes.
And any outcome would be determined by the loss of that material?
That's my opinion at this point, yes.
So you don't believe there was any material that was lost that was significant that day?
No, I really didn't say that. What I said was that I believe that, or what I implied was that we will be able to draw supportable conclusions and analyze the building to understand what happened without the steel that has been disposed of.
In my remaining time, excuse me, Doctor, my light's changing here. I just want to emphasize my support of what Mr. Corbett was talking about. I did not know that you were going to make the suggestion today, sir, of a commission. I was prepared to make a statement today that we should ask the President, as Congress, to initiate a commission similar to what took place after the 1983-84 bombings of our embassies overseas, the Inman Commission, determine what steps are necessary to secure the existing structures, because we can't simply flatten Manhattan or any other major city in this country. We have to deal with the problem because we have major tall structures. But secondly, in the construction of future buildings and of future high-rises, that they be made with the proper structure that could withstand a terrorist attack. Let me just say, and Mr. Chairman, in closing, I'm not so sure that this subcommittee or this committee can actually get to the bottom of this, which I think is your intent. Although I think that your attempt is going to be admirable. I think we need to do more, and that's to let academics do this as well. But I do believe that conspiracy theorists are going to have a field day with this. They're going to make the Warren Commission look like a walk in the park. And that's unfortunate, not only for the members of Congress who are trying to work on this issue, but for all the families out there that are listening very carefully to what we're talking about today, what these experts are saying. And I just think there's so much that has been lost in these last 6 months that we can never go back and retrieve. And it's not only unfortunate, it's borderline criminal. Yeah. And I'll yield back with that, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Crowley. And the whole purpose of this hearing is to get as much information as we can so that we can be very prudent and very thorough in our analysis and make the appropriate recommendations. Let me point out, in response to your line of questioning, the decision was made by the City of New York to dispose of the material before the BPAP team was even on site. And I understand fully what the City of New York was doing. Their first interest was the search and rescue operation, and they had to get the debris out of the way. And it had a BPAP team been on site, and they would have immediately said, you know, we need this. This is evidence. We need this. This is very important. So get it out of sight, obviously. We don't want to hamper the research rescue operation. But at one time, they were even talking about dumping it into the sea to build a new reef for fish. But in any event, it just points up the fact that the material should have been saved, and had there been a timely response of a BPAP team, had we had a protocol in place to get people on site, we know who's in charge and when, someone would have said that. And Dr. Corley, I must say this, I have never found any instance in this whole aftermath where anyone has indicated that the City of New York, which has been absolutely magnificent, was anything but cooperative. So you may not have had the authority legally to say, hey, listen, don't destroy this stuff. This is very important for evidence in our investigation. I'm sure that if someone had said in a timely manner, we would need this, we request that you save it, and you would have got the same response whether you had the authority or not. They were trying to be as cooperative as possible. But we have to understand the whole circumstances. The world literally was collapsing around everything, and they were all in there, and everybody, and the FEMA people, the NIST people when they got on site, the NSF people, everybody was just trying to do everything they possibly could to tie everything together and to get to the bottom of it and to make recommendations on future action so that it will never happen again as much as we can prevent it. And we hope and pray every day it never will happen again. So no one here is suggesting that the people were intentional and in some of their actions that didn't get us where we wanted to get in a timely manner. But we've got an awful lot of questions, and we are determined to continue this probe to continue this review to make certain we have good standing to make very specific and very timely recommendations. Is next. I guess I am next. All right. Well, that's good.
Time's up.
Yeah, time's up. Dr. Corley, we understand that the blueprints were finally obtained when members of your team signed agreements with the Port Authority that you would not testify against it in court. And apparently that delayed getting the blueprints in a timely manner. Is this a routine procedure? And can we get copies of these agreements?
As far as the copies are concerned, I presume that those can be made available, yes. As a routine, I guess I would have to say that this is the first time that I have signed one like that.
But why did it take? Why did it take so long to sign these agreements and get the drawings?
The agreements were signed very early. The timing, I'd have to go back and see exactly what it was.
But it seems like it wasn't something like 4 months later before you actually got the drawings?
That is Roughly the way I remember it, I'm not sure it's exactly 4 months, but it's on that order of magnitude of time, yes. 3.5, I think.
January 8th, well...
yeah, January 8th is when we finally got them. Yes.
Did FEMA help you in getting access to the drawings?
Yes, very definitely they did.
And so you had to intervene, you had to step in.
Yes, we did.
What did you do? Can you tell us?
We called New York City and asked them to release the documents.
And they immediately said yes?
They did say yes.
I mean, why did you have to call it? If they immediately said yes to you, why wouldn't they say yes to your designee?
When did they call?
And when did you call? I mean, can you get that for the record?
Yeah, I can get it for the record, although Craig, you made the call, did you not?
We made a number of calls, I believe, 20th or 21st of December, Mr. Chairman.
Of December?
Correct, Thursday or Friday.
Why so long? That's almost 2.5 months later.
At that particular point in time, we felt that the BPAT team working in a diligent manner to obtain the blueprints. We recognized that there were possible concerns that the city had legally and in a host of other areas, but I will tell you that once we addressed it and focused on it, the Port Authority released the plans on December 26th, approximately 4 or 5 days after our discussions.
That is, I mean, I would hope you would have been working diligently immediately, and and boy, that's 2.5 months. That's an awful long time, and that's lost time. In the meantime, a lot of the evidence, if you will, the steel is being dumped someplace, never more to be found for one. And I'm not suggesting any sinister plots, and as Mr. Crowley has indicated, the tabloid press is going to have a field day with this. We're not interested in providing fodder for them. What we're interested in are facts. Learning from this experience, recommending corrective action, working in partnership to see that that corrective action is initiated ASAP. All right, what else do we have here? Got it. Oh, yeah, Dr. Corley, you also mentioned your testimony. I was amazed by this, that you had some problems getting videotapes from news organizations. Why would they have any problem with giving you videotapes?
Yes, we did have some problems. My understanding is that the tape that had not been played on the networks was not available to us. Anything that had been played, eventually we were able to get access to.
But the one that wasn't played, I mean, you had a reason for requesting it.
Yes, we did.
This is a very important review and investigation. And why wouldn't they? I understand that the networks didn't have some of the tapes on television for all to see because they felt it was not appropriate. Is that your understanding?
There very likely was tape like that also that they did not feel was appropriate, but my understanding was that that had not been used yet was not available to us, and
So what you're suggesting to me that our TV networks were not cooperative in something critically important to the nation.
I would say I felt that they were cooperative in many, many ways, and they did provide us with lots and lots of material.
And I applaud them for that, and that's wonderful, and I think they should as a civic responsibility, but are they going to be selective in what they provide you? Are you going to have a selective investigation, review, and recommendations? I mean, I would think they'd want to be complete. Is there some liability questions, or when you asked for something and they didn't give it to you, what was the reason they gave you for not giving it to you?
I really did not personally hear those reasons. I simply was told that we would only get the tapes that we got. Which
was a request in writing or was it verbal?
It certainly was verbal, and to the best of my knowledge, it was also in writing.
Would you share for the committee, for the record, a copy of the written request
and also a copy of the written response?
We can find that information, yes.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Wiener.
Troubled by what I've heard first, my suggestion, my colleague, Mr. Bartlett, that we shouldn't build up, just build left and right. Perhaps that is true, but I doubt very much there's much demand for skyscrapers in rural Maryland. But I'm also surprised by the characterization of the chairman, however well-meaning, that the city was cooperative. We just heard testimony that the city was the opposite of cooperative, that they had refused to provide basic information. And the issue is when members of the panel signed a document agreeing not to sue, it's where you get off agreeing not to testify. You are public officials gathering information for the public. You don't own it. You don't have the ability to say, I won't use it here, I will use it there. You'll use it wherever we say you'll use it. If you come before us after looking at these blueprints and you decide that the Port Authority was at fault and you raise your right hand because the chairman asked you to, you're going to tell us, I don't care what you sign. The idea that, and this is a government agency, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. It's not a foreign planet. It's not a private company. This is an organization that's funded with our taxpayer dollars, with our fees when we fly in and out of airports. The idea that they should demand that whatever information is collected should not be held against them, well, that's not to me being cooperative. And let's not kid ourselves. Whenever you asked for it, Mr. Wingo, you weren't going to get it unless the New York Times ran a story on Christmas Day. All right? Truth be told, that if it weren't for the fact that attention was called to this and bright light was shown on it, they would not have cooperated. To this day, I'd be surprised if you would have the blueprints that you needed. And to give you a sense of the importance of the blueprints so we all understand it, you know, if we're going to do an investigation of the strength or weaknesses of the trusses that firefighters speak so much about, well, you need the blueprints to find out where to even look, where you look in the rubble. And the idea that the city was cooperative, well, I'm not so sure. You know, the two things are not mutually exclusive. Recovering someone and examining the steel that might have been laying on top of them are not mutually exclusive. You can do that at Great Kills. You can do that on the truck before it's loaded onto the barge. You can do it on the barge. The idea that there was some level of cooperation, I have to tell you, the anecdotal record is replete with stories of people having cameras confiscated from them, being stopped at checkpoints. You're officials of the United States government. The idea that this should have to be a subject of a long negotiation over what information would be at your disposal, to me is most troubling. But let me just ask one question. Mr. Shea, you got my mind spinning when you said the following. You said you think that in 1993, after the failure of bombing of World Trade Center, they immediately went to work on some other ways to topple it. Did you?
I'm sorry?
You said that in 1993 you believe that bin Laden and the terrorists immediately went to work on trying to figure out how to topple the building since they failed. Did you? Did you immediately go to work on that? Did you start to contemplate, well, they failed this time, let's look at why they failed and what we can do to make sure they don't succeed next time?
Congressman, the answer is no.
Did anyone in the United States government do that?
I have no idea. I do not know.
Mr. Corbett, as an academic, are you aware of any academic studies that were done to say, you know what? They missed, but they only missed by a few inches, or they missed by a mile, or if they would have done this or that, it might have been cataclysmic. Did anyone do the same type of thinking with all of it's about 150 years of experience in front of us? Did anyone do what bin Laden, Mr. Shea says, what bin Laden probably did, which is say, well, we struck out this time, how are we going to get it right next time? Does anyone do that in the academic world?
Yeah, we certainly do. It was actually a mitigation report, survey team report from FEMA, document number 984-DR-NY that looked into the issues of the 1993 incident. I don't know what of these issues, though, were ever applied to the building. I know there were improvements made to the Trade Center, certainly, as far as fire protection goes.
Dr. I apologize for getting your name wrong. Weiner, Ashtay, Weiner, whatever. Are you aware, sir, of any of the recommendations that were made following 1993 on structural performance that contemplated a large fire in the building?
No. That's because I'm not in fire engineering.
No, I understand. I just thought perhaps in your research.
But I can comment that after the tragedy of Oklahoma City, quite large number of research and activity was conducted. I did myself quite a lot of studies of how you can prevent tragedies like that and GSA funded, and recently we finished the development.
If you'll forgive me, my time is just about expired. But my concern is the World Trade Center. You didn't need to have an imagination. You can see they came at us in the World Trade Center and they tried to do something. During the trial, it was clear in all the testimony what they were trying to do was bring down the World Trade Center. You didn't need to think that far out of the box for someone to sit down at their computer and say, wow, now that we know what their target is, let's figure out whether or not we're safe from those targets and what steps we can take. Not just stopping cars from getting into the garage, but figuring out, because we might have stumbled upon information that might have been helpful. Thank you.
Yes, there was some activity on that.
Thank you, Mr. Wiener. Mr. Shays. And I would ask the audience to refrain from any expressions of support or disapproval of somebody's statement. This is a very serious, very important hearing, and our witnesses are resources for the committee, and they're giving us their best counsel and best recollection, and we're trying all to be involved in something worthy of our best effort. Thank you. Mr. Shays.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Perhaps with a few number of members, we could even have a third round. I want to say that one thing I'm pretty convinced of since September 11th is there's enough blame to go around for all of us. I mean, we can say what you all should have done. We can say what we should have done. We've been at war with terrorism for 20 years and acted like we didn't know it. And if we had listened to what some of the terrorists were saying in their native tongues, we probably would have known about 9/11. So I'm pretty convinced that we all need to look at ourselves as well. I am pretty convinced, though, that what I've heard today leaves me less comfortable than before I started the hearing. And it started with Mr. Wiener's question of who's in charge, and I thought I knew, and then I asked one of the staff who I should ask my question to, and they told me the person I thought I should ask, I shouldn't. I was going to ask you, Mr. Bement, what you were, Bement?
Bement.
Bement, Mr. Bement, I was going to ask you what you were going to do in all these things, and I realize it's not you, it's Mr. Corley that's really doing this investigation. You just want the investigation, but you have $2 million and would like more, and so on, and you want the authority maybe in the future to do these investigations. So I have two sides to this. What?
Let me correct you. We have actually done some elements of this investigation.
Right.
We've done some computer modeling. We've modeled the fire. We modeled the...
Right. But the overall investigation is not your responsibility. It's Mr. Corley's, correct?
No,
Yeah.
No, I can't have a no and a yes. I mean, I thought this was, yeah.
Yes, Mr. Shays, I did raise my hand that as far as the actual field work and the collection of data, I am in charge of that for the FEMA ASCE team.
Well, in the 5 minutes that is slowly leaving me, I have two sets of questions. One is a set of questions that some of the families who are here would like to know the answer to. And then I would like to know, and I'd like to maybe ask this question for my third round, I want to specifically know, before I leave here, exactly what you would be recommending to Congress, Mr. Shea, and every time they call on you, I jump, but Mr. Shea, only because, okay, the bottom line is I would like to know specifically what you want us to do, what powers you think we need to do so this chairman can recommend to others, if it doesn't all go through his committee, specifically what we should do so there's no question as to who has authority and things happen right away and people have the statutory power and the ability to demand information and to hold people accountable. So that you can start to think about. I want a list before we leave on that. But for the families, is this investigation, Mr. Corley, looking at evacuation procedures? I want a simple question, answer no or yes if it's...
Yes.
Okay, is it going to report on the sprinkler systems not working?
We will mention that and recommend things to be done.
Access to roof eliminated. In other words, people couldn't get to the rooftop because it was blocked off, whereas the last time they could, so some went up rather than down. Will you be looking at why those doors were locked?
No.
Reports of stairway doors being locked, will you be looking at that?
That will be something in our recommendations. We're not specifically doing it here.
Will you checking to see if they were in fact locked? Will you be interviewing witnesses?
No, that will be future work.
Overall safety procedures, i.e. fire drills, fire inspections, and so on, will you be making any comment about that?
Again, that's future work.
lack of communication between the Port Authority and the rescue personnel?
Same answer as future work.
Okay.
We're not directly addressing that.
Is NIST going to do?
Yes.
Yes.
All those things that you mentioned and more. And let me say that...
and by future, now future?
I'm talking about the investigation that we've been talking about during the
okay.
hearing. This broader investigation that we're taking responsibility for, we will address all those issues.
Okay.
And we will start with the investigation that the American Society for Civil
So we'll have some
Engineers-
answers to these questions.
You'll have answers to those questions.
Doors were locked, and so some
That's
of
right.
what Mr. Corley responded as to future, that's basically...
We'll take a much more deliberate approach to getting answers to all those questions.
Okay. And Mr. Shea, I'm going to come back my second round to ask you and others what specific powers we need, who should have those powers, and so on. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. It seems to me, Mr. Shea, that BPAT did not get the aggressive support it needed from the minute this whole thing started from FEMA. I mean, I can't understand, for example, in the blueprints, why it took until December 20, no, it was actually January 8th before they finally got them, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, wasn't that one of the first requests you made? And I understand you didn't drop everything on September 11. I mean, we're all shocked, and once again, let me stress, rightly, everybody was focused on search and rescue, everybody. But it seems to me that fairly soon thereafter, and I'm talking about hours, not days, some action should have been launched to do things like protect the steel and the evidence, to gather the blueprints, to recognize that this was a disaster of monumental proportions, and it's going to require a most comprehensive investigation. It doesn't appear that there was that instant response in the manner that I would like to have seen from FEMA. Can you address that?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I'll do the best I can.
Let me let you think a little bit more, because I wanted to get to Dr. Corley's statement. One of the things he talks about in his testimony, when studying damaged structures, it is important to understand the physical nature of the original structure as soon as possible. As soon as possible. And then later on he said, the delay in the receipt of the plans hindered the team's ability to confirm their understanding of the buildings. Delay, and so they couldn't do the job that we expected them to do as rapidly as we wanted them to do. So please talk to me a little bit about that, if you will.
Mr. Chairman, my reaction to your question is, frankly, I agree with you. There are many things that in hindsight now that we would have done differently, but I have to also say this. It wasn't just a matter of being distracted by other things. We weren't, in fact, trying to react to the entire World Trade Center event. The agency had all its resources pushed.
Oh, you're stretched to the limit. I understand that.
There was no question in my mind that that was the case. And while, again, we would have liked to have done things better, part of the rationale here is this. My belief is, and this is somewhat in response to Congressman Shea's question as well, we started out this hearing by making a recommendation that the National Institute of Standards and Technology be the appropriate agency to carry this type of work out. Part of the reason, quite frankly, is because of the size and technical capability of our agency. I frankly think they won't have the same kinds of issues confronting them should they address an issue of this kind in the future. So that is my recommendation. I mean, I'm serious in that. I believe from a good government standpoint, it makes much more sense to have an agency not directly involved in the immediate response activity or involved in this kind of an issue.
So we learned from experience, and the experience in this unfortunate incident leads us to conclude that we were not as timely and as forceful as we should have been in some areas, including
requesting that the debris be segregated and preserved for future investigation because, as Dr. Corbett points out, it's very important. Dr. Astaneh points out, Dr. Corley, they all agree it's very important. And that the blueprints, I think you have to be scratching your head and yourself wondering why it took 4 months to get those blueprints to begin. I can only conclude that we've never been through something like this before, and boy, I hope we never go through it again. And we better darn well move forward very aggressively in developing a protocol that says if, and we hope it never happens, but if something like this ever happens again, we've got people on site right away. We know who's in charge. We've got video teams, and we've got oral history teams, and we've got bringing in Dr. Corley and his people right away, and we know what questions to ask and who to ask of them. It's sorry that we had to learn the hard way, but I hope we've learned an awful lot from this experience. And well, with that, let me go to Mr. Crowley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Once again, Dr. Astaneh, are you involved officially in the investigation of the World Trade Center disaster attack?
I am not involved with the ASCE team at all.
Dr. Corbett, are you?
No, I'm not involved officially.
Dr. Corley, are any academics involved in the investigation?
Yes, 40% of our core team is from the academic community.
And is, Mr. Corley, is ASCE in charge of obtaining oral testimony or oral evidence?
We are, I would not say we're in charge of that, but we are obtaining some oral oral descriptions of what people saw, did, and what happened.
I'm assuming you know what you're looking for. In other words, the questions that would need to be asked from a technical term would have to come from either yourself or someone like yourself who knows what they're asking.
Absolutely. We know what we're looking for in the areas that this study concerns.
And is that ongoing?
Yes, it is.
And when did it begin? When were you getting that test? When did you start collecting that oral or testimony?
We started collecting some of that before we were on site. We were in contact. People contacted us, and we collected some of that information even before we got on site. And we have continued to collect it when we can find people that have information we're after.
Let me just ask this question, Mr. Corley, Dr. Corley. You mentioned future studies.
Yes.
As opposed to the present study. Can you just clarify for me and maybe for the people in this room what you mean by that?
Yes. What I'm referring to is that when we finish our report and it becomes or is transmitted in the month of April, I'm talking about whatever happens after that point.
Are you running into any other roadblocks in terms of not only the city or the state or any other entity in terms of obtaining information that you request?
Well, as in any project like this, there are difficulties in collecting information because people don't know where it is, things like that. And we have the normal number of problems like that in this study.
I mean, I'm talking specifically about government agencies. Are you still running into roadblocks like the one you experienced in January in which you had to sign a document saying you would not testify in court?
I would not be able to name you any additional ones than things that have been discussed today, but if I thought about it, I might come up with something, but I don't think of anything right now.
Mr. Bement, you said earlier that, well, I don't know if you said this or not, but there apparently seems to be a problem in terms of being able to gather information in terms of working cooperatively with local and city government. Is that correct?
No, we haven't run into any of those problems as yet. As a matter of fact, one of the most valuable sources of oral history will be from the New York Fire Department in the recounting of the events from the firefighters themselves. And
would you describe the events of early January as a problem?
Tell me what events you're referring to.
In terms of Mr. Corley having to sign a document stating that he would not testify in court against the Port Authority or the city, I'm assuming.
It certainly was an impediment to his study. I consider it to be a problem.
I thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Well, Mr. Shays.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the witnesses, I would like to know what powers are needed specifically and who should have these powers to do an investigation almost in with the, well, I don't want to even prejudice, to do a thorough investigation. Mr. Shea, do you want to start?
From our perspective in FEMA, I think that we, again, would want to say that we feel the National Institute of Standards and Technology is the appropriate agency. They have some existing authority, but I think this committee, through this hearing today, has already identified some areas where they would need some additional
Okay,
authority.
so they should have the authority.
Yes.
And then what particular powers should they have, or should it have?
Well, again, I would defer to Dr. Bement on that, but my belief is they obviously want to have access to sites, ready access to the design and construction drawings, things of this nature.
Mr. Bement?
Yes. I think, first of all, we would have to have a reserve funding mechanism so that we could bring parties on board. We'd have to have something like a National Construction Studies Board.
Yeah, let me ask you, the National Constructions Board, was this what looked at l'ambiance in Bridgeport when we lost 18 people?
No,
well, who did that work?
There is a National Transportation Studies Board that has the authorities and the first response responsibility.
Someone, can you consult with anyone who can tell you who did l'ambiance? No, I don't.
We did the study, and OSHA changed the mandatory standards.
Identify yourself for the record, please.
I'm Shyam Sundar. I'm Chief of the Structures Division at NIST.
Okay, I'm sorry. And what was the answer?
And we did the study, and OSHA changed the mandatory standards as a result of that.
Okay, thank you very much. So you all did the study. I interrupted you. So you talked about the construction board, and then, I'm sorry, Mr. Bement.
Well, we're all talking about faster response, and what that means is there has to be an organization in place that is empowered to immediately arrive on the scene, that has sufficient authority to gather evidence, that has subpoena power, and that has the adequate funding mechanisms to carry on whatever investigation at whatever scale is needed, whatever is necessary. I would also add, you know, it's almost a no-brainer that there's no reason why building blueprints have to be in paper or vellum format. They could be on electronic format, in which case everyone could have the zip file. I mean, the firefighters could have their disk. A lot of people could have that disk.
Well, there'd be some we wouldn't want to have that information. So, anything else?
No.
The gentleman
No,
who just
sir.
came, could I invite you just to come back and just tell me, with l'ambiance, was there a subpoena power? Was there other powers that accompanied that investigation?
No, we've typically not required that because the statute, as you know, says that any work we do is not cannot be used in a court of law. And also, federal employees can't serve as expert witnesses in general. So.
And what was the purpose for not being in a court of law? What's the motivation for that?
Usually, we draw a distinction between structural failures and failures after natural disasters. In the case of structural failures, there's usual litigation problems between different parties. And since we are doing a technical study focusing on the technical issues, we don't go into issues of finding fault or negligence.
Thank you. Mr. Bement, if you would help me a second, wouldn't you need also the authority to look at malfeasance, just a failure for someone doing their job properly? Wouldn't it have to involve not just structural issues, but other issues as well?
Again, our role is to do technical studies. And
no, but that's maybe suggests that maybe you should only play a part, and Mr. Shea, that there needs to be some other organization that looks at this from a holistic point of view. I mean, if doors are locked, if processes aren't followed that should be, it would suggest to me that NIST wouldn't be.
Oh, I think there would be many organizations that would get involved at that stage in.
No, but that's what we're trying to avoid.
Evidence.
We're trying to avoid, if everybody's responsible, nobody is. We want one board ultimately, or one group ultimately, it seems to me, to have the authority to look at every aspect of why something happened that shouldn't have happened. And so that really argues for you being a part of this, but somebody else having a greater role.
Well, I think the point here is, at what point do you want to get beyond conducting an independent, open, public, unbiased study that's inclusive to going to the other extreme of developing evidence and fault finding and
Yeah, but when NTSB looks at something, they look at pilot performance. Besides looking at structural issues, they look at a lot of issues. They don't just look at one part. So I mean, I understand where you're coming from. It may make sense for you to focus on just structural issues, but ultimately this committee needs to make a recommendation that I think does
agree
more
with
than
that.
Okay.
Yes, I agree with
Okay.
that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chase. You know, as I mentioned in my opening statement, this investigation seems to be unusually concerned with secrecy. Can you explain that to me, Mr. Shea, why that's so? And why, we know, for example, that the Port Authority did not take this approach after the 93 bombing. And what is the nature of the confidentiality agreements that BPAP participants were asked to sign?
The nature is that the team members won't disclose publicly the conversations and opinions that are going on during the course of their deliberations. This is primarily intended to protect the scientific integrity of the process. But
that, Dr. Corley, didn't you say that is unusual?
My comment was that I don't recall that I've signed an agreement like that in the past.
Mr. Shea, do you recall requesting such agreements in previous instances?
Yeah, our confidentiality agreements are standard fare as part of the way that we've historically done these building performance assessment teams.
But why all the secrecy? I mean, we didn't have a spokesperson for FEMA out talking to the public. I mean, obviously, when you've got an ongoing investigation, you don't give chapter and verse along the way. But it seems that there was undue secrecy, and people were just hungry for more information. Do you think I'm unfair in characterizing the situation as one involving undue secrecy?
I guess I'm a little taken aback by that, Mr. Chairman. My opinion of the situation is that what we were attempting to do was provide an environment for scientists and technical engineers and academicians to come to judgments, and this often involves opinions, and give them an opportunity to bring their opinions forward in an unbiased way and free from any undue influence from outside parties.
Yeah, but do you have a spokesperson to deal with the rest of the world other than the Dr. Corley and his team, the BPAP team, and those who are involved internally in the process? I mean, there are a lot of questions, understandably, from the rest of the world.
Right.
But was there a spokesperson to address those questions on behalf of FEMA?
As far as I understand, if we were asked questions, that we did try and respond to them. I'm not aware of any circumstance in which we were unresponsive to somebody. In fact, I was interviewed as part of this process. I did engage in a conference call with some people who had some concerns about our issue, and I'm
just reading from the SOP, the Standard Operating Procedures, March 2000 Building Performance Assessment Team Program. A BPAP Media Advisors Liaison is selected by the DFO Public Information Officer to act as the liaison between the BPAP and media relations staff and the DFO and the media. All media contacts are referred to the Media Affairs Liaison. So if my office called up, or just John Q. Citizen called up on the 17th of October and said, who's your Media Affairs Liaison, who would you have referred?
But that would have been somebody in our disaster field office in New York City. Frankly, I'm sorry, I don't have a name.
Okay,
I
don't expect you to know the name of all your employees.
But in fact, there was somebody there. There was a media liaison who would deal with issues of that nature.
Yeah, well, counsel just points out to me that in some instances, leaks to the media sort of backfired, because that's not a desirable way to do business, have leaks.
I couldn't agree more, Mr. Chairman. Yeah.
But leaks only come about when there are people who are sort of frustrated in many instances that information isn't getting out to the public,
And so they do it in bits and dribbles, and sometimes it compromises an ongoing investigation or works contrary to the desired result in terms of the ongoing investigation. That's why I happen to believe public information is very important. And I would have thought that maybe a higher level person than just a person on the site in a field office, not having a great deal of authority and not being able to speak with authority for FEMA, that's really an awesome responsibility to put on someone like that.
I don't disagree with you. In those circumstances, my anticipation is that the field office would have brought that up to Washington, and that they would have involved myself or Mr. Winger or others in the response to any of those issues.
Thank you. Mr. Wiener.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, let me begin by offering my apologies to you, Mr. Chairman, and to members of the panel. If I got a little excited and loud earlier, being from New York, we sometimes don't modulate our voices.
I want you to know, Mr. Wiener, I also am from New York, and I'm proud of it.
And I also by no means mean to imply that any of the members of the panel are responsible for these lapses. I believe you are cogs in a badly flawed, not to the extent that there are any cogs there, you're cogs in a very flawed machine and a bad apparatus. And let me make that clear. But I think what we're seeing increasingly from both the chairman's previous questions and others throughout the day is that the model you should be looking at is the NTSB. The NTSB, it would be absurd, borderline ludicrous, for them to go to American Airlines and say, please let us see the diagram of your 767. Please, we promise that if we find out that fibercarbons had weakened the tail, we won't tell anybody. It's mind-boggling. It's silly. I don't see any reason why the modus operandi should be any different from examining a building. The NTSB has made did about a dozen or so briefings in the first 5 or 6 days. Sometimes they said, you know what, we can't tell you stuff because we just don't know it. As a matter of fact, I had dozens of conversations with the head of the NTSB, and I always commend her. I said, you know, the temptation must be to say, well, maybe it's this or maybe it's that, and they don't do that. But what they do is they do give regular updates. They let reporters throw the questions. They let members of Congress know. They let the families know we're going to be giving an update. And as things are discounted or ruled in or ruled out, they let you know. And the final thing that they do is they come out with a report. And by the time the report comes out, there is such credibility imbued in that document that instantly airlines start reacting, the FAA start reacting, and we as citizens start saying, I'm glad they got to the bottom of that. The theory that I heard on day one turned out not to be exactly right. So the easiest and best answer to give to the chairman's last series of questions was, you know what, we're going to start giving an update to you, the public, to members of the press, to you members of Congress every so often. Even if we don't have all the answers, we're going to stand in front of you. We're going to clarify the chain of command. We're going to have the people there, the experts. We're going to answer the questions. I don't even know who to ask anymore, but can you assure that you'll do that in the months to come? Say that if we don't have a report in the next 6 months, we'll come back and maybe not give it to you in Congress, but we'll have regular briefings at the NIST headquarters on how things are going.
Sir, yes, I can assure you that will happen.
Terrific. And let me just ask one other substantive thing. And as you proceed with your investigation, a couple of things that have come up. One has come up from the oral history given by the firefighters about the problems with communication. Part of it, sadly, was a reflection of 1993. They found there were problems with repeaters in the buildings that allow the radios to work. If one of the things that you can look at is ways to design into buildings a black box type of apparatus to allow the infrastructure of firefighting to remain intact, to allow, you know, it's the old joke, you know, they always recover the black boxes. Why don't they make the plane out of the black box material so they can recover everybody?
You know, I'm just delighted for you to bring that up because that's in our 03 budget request.
Okay, but if you can look at that, and a second issue that has come up repeatedly as I have spoken to the families, you know, something that unifies the families of the victims almost to a person is they were on the higher floors. If you can take a look at the idea of building into high-rises a place for a helicopter to land, figuring out, all right, we need to have antenna and the like. figuring out ways as you design buildings to think about the people who are on the rotunda floors and think about the ones that are not. And even if it is not, as Mr. Bartlett perhaps would like us to take every building that's over 6 floors and chop them off and put them next to each other, if we can start thinking about the real world experiences of firefighters, that I don't care, these guys were on the 50-something floor on their way up. We have witnesses who are talking about firefighters carrying enough gear to make up my body weight going up while people were coming down. If we can think about this as not just an academic exercise, if we can think about ways to design buildings and retrofit buildings to think about the men and women who are going to be called in the worst possible case scenario, that doesn't mean tear the buildings down, but figure out a way to include in the infrastructure ways. Who knows? I mean, I think it was I don't know, it was Mr. Corbett and Mr. Shea who talked about the wing cut through the pipe that carried the water. Maybe there's no way to avoid that, but I can tell you one thing. That, there was only nominal thought given to what would happen if there was a fire up there. To be honest with you, I don't know if anyone, even, you can put a standpipe on the 103rd floor. If you're not thinking about how someone on the 103rd floor is going to talk to the base downstairs, what's the point? So if you can think of that as well and make that part of your research.
Mr. Weiner, we're in violent agreement on that point, and we will carry that out as a key part of our investigation, without doubt.
I thank you, and let me reiterate my thank for you, Mr.
Thank you very much, Mr. Weiner and Mr. Shays. You two have been magnificent. You've been here all day, and it's obvious, it should be obvious to everyone in the audience that this isn't the first time they've been introduced to the subject. A lot of preparation goes into a hearing like this, a lot of discussions, and I really thank you for your diligence and your active participation. And I want to clear up something for the record, Dr. Corley, because you said, I want to make sure I understand it correctly, that shortly after September 11, you signed a confidentiality agreement. You said you hadn't signed one like that before. Which confidentiality agreement were you referring to? The one from the Port Authority or the one from FEMA? Or both?
I was referring to the one from the Port Authority.
So that's the SOP, as Mr. Shea had indicated, the type of agreement you signed with FEMA.
Yes, I think that that agreement, that standard agreement, I had signed.
I mean, it didn't sound out of line when he mentioned that to me. So, but I want to make sure the record was clear.
Yeah, I'm sorry if I confused you.
No.
Mr. Chairman, if I could, that was the standard agreement in the Oklahoma City report as well.
Sure, I understand. But I just want to make sure the record.
And for the past 20 or 30 or 40 BPATs.
Well, look, I think we've learned a lot of things this afternoon. Some things that raise concerns and that underscore some of the points I made right at the beginning. First, right now, there are no clear lines of authority as to who in the federal government is to conduct an investigation of a building failure. No one is in charge. No one is sure what powers the federal government can exercise. No one is sure of the scope of an investigation, and that has to be fixed right away. And I see a lot of nodding of heads from the panel, and I appreciate that. We need an enhanced disaster investigation protocol in place, thank you, Dr. Corbett, so that from minute one, someone will assume a recognized leadership role. Someone has to be in charge or no one is. And having no one in charge is unacceptable. Some of it can be fixed by the federal agencies, and I understand the handing the ball from FEMA to NIST, which I think is logical and makes sense. But some of it has to be fixed by those of us up here in the Congress with legislation, and we're going to be looking for very specific proposals. For starters, we got to know right now who's in charge in the instant case. Second, NIST needs to move forward with its more extended work on the lessons of the collapse. We need to see that NIST has the authority and this is essential, the money to move ahead. And we're not talking about nickels and dimes. Money should not and will not be an obstacle, if this committee has anything to say about it, to a thorough and timely investigation and recommendations. But NIST is going to have to present a more detailed plan on exactly what it will spend its money on and when.
Mr. Chairman, we can provide more detail for the record than what you've received so far. But
and in doing that, a lot of questions have been asked. One question that hasn't been asked directly of you.
You've had 14 different pronunciations of your name today. Would you pronounce it for the committee so that we'll...
Well, Mr. Chairman, I have 8 children, and they all pronounce it differently also. It's Bement.
Bement. Thank you.
That's the official version.
Thank you. Let the record show that. I want to emphasize again that correcting these deficiencies will not only help in this case, but will help us learn from future events regardless of whether they are caused by nature or by man. This committee is committed to following up on today's hearing to ensure that the confusion and uncertainty we have brought to light today does not persist into the future. With that, let me thank the very patient panel, my colleagues up here who have given so much of their time and talent, and to all of you witnesses. You will be hearing further from us with written submissions, and we ask that you give us a timely written response. With that, if I can find the gavel, I will adjourn this hearing.
Waiting so long.